Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. The lane to Greenhollow Farm ran down from the ridge in a long curve between hedgerows that had not been cut back this year and would not be cut back by the people who had always cut them, because by this evening, the people who had always done anything at Greenhollow would no longer be the people who did things there. Elizabeth Tarrant, Bess, to everyone who had ever known her, which in this part of Dorset was everyone, walked down the lane in the grey light before sunrise with her shawl pulled close against the September chill, and a key in her coat pocket that she did not need because the door was never locked and had not been locked in 52 years, and she had brought it anyway because some part of her had wanted to hold something solid on the walk down. The hedgerows on either side were heavy with the last of the blackberries, dark and full, going soft now, nobody having come to pick them this year because there had been no year. Not really. Not since her father's stroke in the spring and his death in August, and the weeks since that had passed the way weeks pass when a house is waiting for something it does not want. She knew this lane, the way she knew the back of her own hand. Better, really, because hands changed, and the lane had not in 52 years. She knew which ruts filled with water after rain and which stayed dry. She knew the gate that needed lifting on its hinges before it would swing, and the place where the bank dropped away to show the stream below, and the particular curve where, if you looked up at exactly the right moment on a clear morning, you could see the church tower of Ashkam 2 miles off, sitting on its own small rise like something set down carefully and left. The auctioneer's clerk would arrive at 10 to begin the inventory. The sale itself was set for 2 o'clock. It was not yet 6. She had 2 hours. She had asked for nothing else. Not money, not time to argue the figures, not even in the end much sympathy, because sympathy from the village had a way of arriving with its own agenda, and she had not had the strength to manage anyone else's feelings about this on top of her own. What she had asked for from the solicitor, in a voice she had kept very level, was, "I should like the house to myself for the last morning, just the morning." And he had looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who deals professionally with loss and occasionally remembers what it is. And he had said, "Of course, Miss Tarrant, of course." She came round the last bend in the lane. The house was there, the way it had always been there, long and low, the grey stone gone gold at this hour where the first light caught the eastern wall, the thatch dark with the night's dampness, smoke not yet rising from the kitchen chimney, because there was no one to light the fire this morning, because the fire had not been lit this morning and would not be lit by her hands again. She stood at the gate for a moment and looked at it. Then she lifted the latch. It required the particular twist it had always required, the one her father used to say only the Tarrants knew, though in fact anyone who tried it more than once learned it readily enough, and she went in. The kitchen door was unlatched, as it always was, and it opened with the sound it had always made, a long, low note from the lower hinge, which her father had oiled every spring for as long as she could remember, and which had developed, over decades of identical oiling, its own particular pitch, not quite a creak, something closer to a sigh, the sound of a door that had opened 10,000 times and had made its peace with opening. Bess stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. The kitchen at Greenhollow was the heart of the house, in the way that kitchens were the heart of houses like this one. Not a room you visited, but a room you lived inside. The room where everything that mattered had happened, was discussed, was decided, was mourned and celebrated and endured. The flagstone floor worn into a shallow path between the door and the hearth and the table, a path made by feet, by her mother's feet and her father's feet and her own feet and the feet of two brothers long since gone to Canada. 40 years of feet, wearing a softness into stone that nothing else in the room had. The hearth was cold. It had been cold for 3 days, since she had let the fire go out deliberately. There had seemed no point in keeping it, with the inventory coming and the rooms to be gone through. And she had told herself this was practical, and it had been practical, and she had also cried for an hour afterward without entirely understanding why, except that the kitchen fire at Greenhollow had not been allowed to go out, not properly out, not down to cold ash, in living memory. Her mother had banked it every night for 30 years. Bess had banked it every night for the 20 years since. She crossed to the hearth now and crouched down. The particular crouch, knees out, one hand on the hearthstone for balance, that her body had performed every morning of her life, and that her body performed now without being asked, the muscles simply remembering the shape of the action, even though there was nothing to do, no fire to tend, no kettle to fill. The hearthstone was cold under her palm. She had never felt it cold before. Even on the coldest mornings of winter, there had been some residual warmth in the stone from the banked coals beneath the ash. Now, nothing, just stone, and the particular grey light of 6 in the morning coming through the kitchen window, and the long table where 4 people, and then 2 people, and then, for these last months, 1 person had taken every meal of every day for half a century. She stayed crouched at the hearth for a little while. Then she stood. Her knees told her about it, the way they had begun to tell her about things in the last several years. And she walked to the window. The kitchen window faced east, toward the rise where the church tower of Ashkam stood. And at this hour, the light was beginning to come up behind it. Not sunrise yet, but the deep gold grey that precedes sunrise. The light that makes everything it touches look as though it has been waiting specifically for this. Bess stood at the window the way she had stood at it perhaps 20,000 times. There was a particular spot on the floor. She was standing on it now, worn very slightly differently from the floor around it, because this was where you stood to look out while the kettle filled, or while bread proved, or while you were thinking about something and needed, for a moment, to look at something further away than the room. The light came across the yard and lit the top of the old apple tree by the gate, the tree her grandfather had planted, according to family report, in the year of Waterloo, which made it 74 years old this autumn, and which still, against all reasonable expectation, produced apples, though fewer each year and smaller. She had stood here on the morning of her mother's funeral 20 years ago in this same light. She remembered this specifically, the particular gold grey of a September morning, because her mother had died in September too, at the very end of the month, and the light had been exactly this light, and Bess had stood at this window in her black dress before anyone else was awake, and had looked at the apple tree and had thought, I don't know how to do this without her. And she had done it. 20 years of doing it, keeping the house, keeping her father, keeping the rhythm of Greenhollow, going through the years that followed, through her father's slow decline from a vigorous man to an old one, to, finally, a dying one, through two brothers' departures for a country she had never seen and would now, she supposed, never see, through the long, slow attrition of a farm that had been struggling since before she was born and had finally, this year, stopped. She had done it, and now there was nothing left to do, and the light was the same light, and she stood at the same window, and the apple tree was still there, slightly more bent than it had been 20 years ago, slightly fewer apples, but there. She thought, someone else will stand here. Someone else will look at that tree. She did not yet know how she felt about this. She thought she might need the whole 2 hours to find out. She went through to the scullery, which was a small stone-flagged room off the kitchen's north side, colder than the kitchen even in summer, where the washing was done and the boots were kept, and where, in winter, the milk was set to keep before it went through to the dairy proper. The scullery had a particular smell. It always had, for as long as she could remember, a smell of cold stone and damp, and the faint mineral note of well water, because the pump was here, set into the corner, its iron handle worn smooth and slightly bright where 50 years of hands had gripped it. Bess put her hand on the pump handle now. She did not work it. There was no need. She was not filling anything. But she held it for a moment, feeling the particular shape of it, the place where the iron had been worn into a shallow curve that fit a hand, any hand, because so many hands had held it, in exactly this way that the iron itself had given way slightly, had agreed to be held. Her mother's hand, her father's hand, her own hand, every morning, for the kettle, for the washing, for the endless small necessities of water that a farmhouse required. She remembered being small enough that she had needed both hands on the handle, and her feet had needed to leave the ground slightly with the effort of pushing it down, and her mother had laughed, not unkindly, the warm laugh she had had before things became hard, and had said, "You'll grow into it, Bess. Everyone grows into the pump eventually." She had grown into it. She had grown into all of it, the pump, the hearth, the dairy, the whole daily architecture of the house, until it fit her exactly, until her body had become, in a sense, a continuation of the house's own shape, moving through it in the grooves the house had worn for her, and that she had worn deeper in turn. And now, someone else would grow into it. Some other hand would learn the particular give of this handle, the particular pitch of the kitchen door, the particular cold of the scullery flags in winter. She let go of the pump handle. She looked at the row of boots by the door, her father's still there. no one having moved them, because moving them had seemed, each time she had thought about it in the last month, like a thing that could wait, and now it could not wait any longer, except that it could, because today someone else would move them, or throw them away, or keep them for their own use without ever knowing whose feet had shaped them. She left the boots where they were. She went on. The dairy was reached through a low door from the scullery, low enough that even Bess, who was not a tall woman, ducked slightly out of habit, though the lintel had been raised 6 inches in her grandfather's time, and there was, in fact, ample clearance now. The body remembered what the door had once required and continued to comply, decades after the requirement had ended. The dairy was the coolest room in the house, built that way deliberately. Thick walls, a north-facing window set high and small, a stone floor that stayed cold even in the height of summer. The shelves that ran along 2 walls were empty now, the last of the cheeses sold off in the spring, the last of the cream going these final months, only as far as the kitchen, because there had been no one to sell to and no reason to make more than the household needed. Bess stood in the middle of the dairy and looked at the empty shelves and felt, for the first time this morning, something that was close to anger, not at any person, not even really at the circumstances, but at the simple fact of emptiness in a room that had never, in her lifetime, been empty. The dairy at Greenhollow had always held something. Pans of milk setting, the cream rising in its slow gold layer, cheeses under their cloths, the particular sour-sweet smell of a working dairy that she had breathed every day of her life and had never once, until this morning, thought to notice as a smell at all, because it had simply been the smell of being alive, the smell of the air itself. The room smelled of nothing now, or rather, it smelled of stone and of the particular cold mineral quality of an unused room, and underneath that, very faint, the last ghost of what it had been, a thinness in the air where the smell of milk had been and was no longer. She walked to the marble slab where the pans had stood, a great slab of cold stone, kept always scrupulously clean, on which her mother had taught her to read the surface of milk the way other people read faces. This one's ready. This one needs another hour. This one's turned and must go to the pigs. There were no pigs either. They had gone in the spring, with the last of the stock that could be sold to settle the most pressing debts. Bess put both hands flat on the cold marble slab, the way she had 1,000 times, checking pans that were not there, and stood like that for a moment, with her eyes closed, and the room around her was completely silent except for the small sounds a stone building makes in the early morning, a settling somewhere in the roof, the very faint movement of air through the high window, and she thought, this room held 40 years of mornings. Every one of them is still here in a way. They're just not visible anymore. She opened her eyes. She took her hands from the slab. She went on. The pantry was a narrow room between the kitchen and the passage, shelved floor to ceiling. And it had been, for as long as Bess could remember, the room that held the evidence of the year. The preserves, the pickles, the dried herbs hung in their bunches from the beam, the sacks of flour and oats in their proper places, the whole accumulated record of what the farm had produced and what the household had made of it. It was not empty, not entirely. There were still jars on the shelves, the last of last year's preserves, because preserves did not sell at auction the way livestock and equipment did, and no one had thought to do anything with them, and so they stood in their rows. Damson, the dark red of blackberry and apple, the pale gold of quince, each jar labelled in her mother's hand originally, and for the last 20 years in Bess's own hand, which had become, she noted now, looking at the labels, very like her mother's hand, the same slant, the same particular way of forming the capital letters, so that if you did not know better, you might think the same person had labelled all of them across 40 years in one continuous, unbroken hand. She took one of the jars down, blackberry and apple, dated last September, the autumn before her father's stroke, and held it for a moment, looking at the label. Blackberry and apple, September 1888. Her own hand, her mother's hand underneath it, in the way that a daughter's handwriting carries a mother's handwriting, the way a face carries a resemblance, not identical, but unmistakably descended. The dried herbs hung from the beam above her head, lavender from the bed by the kitchen door, planted by her mother and tended by Bess for the 20 years since, rosemary from the bush by the dairy wall, which had been there longer than anyone could say, possibly longer than the house itself in some form, because rosemary like that did not die, only spread, generation after generation of the same plant, continuing outward from whatever original root had been put in the ground. Thyme, sage, the bunches of mint that had always, every summer, threatened to take over the entire bed by the gate, and had always, every autumn, been cut back to nothing, and had always, every spring, returned. She thought, someone will eat these preserves. Some stranger will open this jar of blackberry and apple, and not know that the blackberries came from the hedgerow on the lane, the one that was heavy and unpicked this year, or that the apples came from the tree by the gate that her grandfather planted in the year of Waterloo. They would just be preserves. Good preserves, she thought. She had not lost her skill, even in this last difficult year, but without their history, the history would be invisible to whoever ate them. It would simply disappear, the way most history disappears. Not destroyed exactly, just no longer carried by anyone, no longer attached to anything, floating free until it faded entirely. She put the jar back on the shelf, in its place, exactly where it had been. The passage that ran from the kitchen to the front of the house was narrow and dim, even at the brightest part of the day, lit only by the small window at its far end where the front door was, and Bess walked down it now in the grey early light with her hand trailing along the wall the way it always had, not for support, but because the wall was there, and her hand had always touched it, and the plaster under her palm was cool and slightly uneven in the particular way of old plaster with its small variations and its patches where it had been repaired over the decades by hands that were not quite as skilled as the original plasterers had been. There was a low place in the passage floor, a slight dip, perhaps an inch, where the flagstones had settled unevenly sometime in the previous century, and had never been corrected, because correcting it would have meant taking up the whole floor. And nobody at Greenhollow had ever had the money or the inclination for that kind of correction when the existing arrangement worked perfectly well once you knew it was there. Bess's feet found the dip without her thinking about it. the particular small downward step, and then up again, a rhythm so embedded in her walking that she had genuinely never, in 52 years, tripped on it, though she had watched a number of visitors over the years catch their toe on the upward edge and stumble, surprised, in a passage that looked, to an unfamiliar eye, perfectly level. She thought, the house knows how to walk through itself. Or not the house. Me. I know how to walk through the house. The house has taught me, over 52 years, exactly how to move through every part of it without thinking. And that knowledge is in my feet and my hands and the muscles of my legs, and none of it transfers. None of it can be written down or explained. Whoever buys this house will trip on this step a dozen times before they learn it, and then they'll know it the way I know it, and it'll become theirs. She stood for a moment in the low place in the floor, feeling the very slight unevenness under her feet, and thought about all the small physical knowledges a body accumulates about a place over a lifetime, the steps that creak and the ones that don't, the doors that stick in damp weather and need a particular lift and turn, the exact pressure required on a particular latch, the place on the stairs where the banister was loose and had been loose for 30 years, and everyone simply knew not to lean on it there. All of it would have to be relearned. All of it would have to be forgotten by her and learned again by someone else. And the overlap, the period during which both kinds of knowledge existed, hers fading and theirs forming, would last only as long as it took the new owners to walk through the house enough times. She went on, down the passage, toward the stairs. The staircase at Greenhollow rose from the passage in 2 short flights, with a turn at a small landing, and the 3rd step from the bottom. Bess stepped onto it now, deliberately, the way she sometimes had as a child, testing it, produced the sound it had always produced, a particular creak, neither loud nor soft, more a complaint than a cry, the sound of old wood underweight in a way it had voiced 10,000 times, and would, presumably, voice 10,000 times more, for someone else. She remembered being told, as a small child, that the 3rd step creaked because a ghost lived under it. This had been her father's invention, told with the particular relish fathers bring to such inventions, and she had believed it for years, had stepped over the 3rd step entirely for an embarrassingly long stretch of her childhood, until her brother Robert, 4 years older and considerably less patient with such things, had stamped on it deliberately, repeatedly, until she stopped being afraid and started, instead, finding it funny, the idea that a step could complain, that wood could have an opinion about being walked on. She stood on the 3rd step now and let it creak under her weight, on purpose, the way she had not done in years. There had been no need, recently, to make the step complain. She simply walked over it, the way you walk over things you've stopped noticing, and the sound it made was exactly the sound it had always made. And for a moment, standing there in the grey morning light, with her hand on the banister, she felt her father's presence so strongly that she nearly turned to see if he was behind her. He was not behind her. He had not been behind her, on this staircase or anywhere else, for a month. But the step remembered him. The step had creaked under his weight for 60 years. He had grown up in this house too, had been a child here before he was the man who told ghost stories about the 3rd step to his own children. And the step, in its wooden way, held all of that, every weight that had ever pressed down on it, every foot accumulated into the particular quality of its complaint. She thought, when I'm gone, the step will still creak. It'll creak for whoever comes next, and they'll have no idea why, and they'll just think, this step creaks, and they'll step over it, or they'll get it fixed. And either way, the creak will mean nothing to them, because the creak isn't really about the step. The creak is about everyone who's ever stood on it. And that's me now. I'm part of what makes it creak, and no one will ever know that. She went up the stairs. The step creaked once more behind her, settling back. The landing at the top of the stairs was small, barely more than a turning space, with doors opening off it to the 3 bedrooms, and at the end, a steep, narrow stair to the attic. And it was lit at this hour by the grey light coming through the small window that looked out over the yard toward the barn. Bess paused on the landing. There was something here she had been aware of, in the back of her mind, since she walked through the kitchen door this morning, something she had been moving toward without quite letting herself think about it directly. The way you approach something difficult by a roundabout path, visiting other rooms first, giving yourself time. On the door frame of her own old bedroom, the smaller of the 2 rooms that had been the children's rooms, the one she had slept in from the time she was old enough to have her own bed until the day, 20 years ago, when her mother died and Bess had moved into the larger room, the one that had been her parents'. On that door frame, on the side facing the landing, there were marks. She did not look at them yet. She stood on the landing in the grey light and looked, instead, out the small window at the yard below. The barn, dark against the lightening sky, the empty stable beside it, the yard itself swept clean because she had swept it yesterday, out of some instinct she hadn't examined, the instinct that said, whatever else happens, the yard should be swept. She would look at the door frame. She knew she would look at it. It was, in some way she could not fully articulate, the reason she had asked for this morning, the thing underneath all the other things she had told the solicitor and herself about needing to say goodbye to the rooms. But not yet. First, the rooms themselves. She turned to her parents' door, her own door for the last 20 years, and went in. Her parents' bedroom, her bedroom now, though she still thought of it, in some unexamined part of her mind, as theirs, faced east like the kitchen below it, and the light here was further along than it had been downstairs. The grey was beginning to take on the first faint warmth that meant the sun was close. The bed was made. She had made it yesterday, out of the same instinct that had swept the yard, the instinct that insisted on certain forms being observed even when, perhaps especially when, their purpose had ended. The room was tidy, her father's things. What few personal things he had kept in this room in his last years, when he had moved back into it after her mother's death. Unable to sleep, he said, in the smaller room he'd used in between, had been sorted already in the difficult weeks after his death. The clothes given to the church for those who needed them, the small effects distributed according to his wishes, which had been simple and few. What remained was the room itself, the window with its view east toward Ashkam, the fireplace swept and empty, the wardrobe, its doors closed on emptiness, the washstand with its jug and basin, both empty, both clean. Bess stood in the middle of the room and thought about her mother in this room, getting up in the early mornings of 40 years, dressing in this light, this same grey-gold September light that had not changed in 40 years, even though everything else had. She thought about her mother's hands, doing up the small buttons of her dress in front of the mirror that had hung. Was it still there? She looked. It was. A small mirror in a plain dark frame, hung beside the window, slightly spotted now with age, the silvering gone thin in patches, so that a face looking into it would see itself slightly ghosted, slightly doubled at the edges. She walked to the mirror and looked into it. Her own face looked back at her, 52 years old, the face she had grown into the way she had grown into the pump handle and the third stair and all the rest of it. A face that had her mother's eyes, people had always said, and her father's particular set to the mouth that didn't give much away. She thought, how many faces has this mirror held? Her mother's, every morning, for 40 years. Her grandmother's, before that. This had been her grandmother's mirror originally, brought from the house in Sherborne, where her mother had grown up. Her own face for 52 years, watching itself become the face it was now. And after today, someone else's face, a stranger's face, in this same slightly ghosted glass, with no idea what other faces it had held. She looked at herself for a moment longer. Then she turned away from the mirror and went to the window and looked out the way her mother must have looked out 10,000 mornings at the same view. The yard, the barn, the rise toward Ashkam, the light coming up. She thought about her mother specifically now, not the general presence she had been feeling all morning, but her mother as a particular person in this particular room in the last months of her life. Her mother had died slowly, of the kind of illness that takes its time and gives the people around it time too. Time to say things or not say them. Time to sit with someone through the long afternoons of a final autumn. Bess had been 32. She had nursed her mother through that last September, in this room, in this bed, and she remembered with absolute clarity the particular quality of those weeks, the way the light came through this window in the afternoons, gold and low, exactly as it was beginning to come now, though it was morning rather than afternoon. The way her mother had liked the window open a little, even as the weather turned cold, because she said she wanted to hear the rooks in the elms beyond the barn. The way her mother, in the last days, had stopped talking about practical things, the dairy, the accounts, the small daily business of the farm that had occupied so much of her conversation for so many years, and had started, instead, talking about much older things, her own childhood in Sherborne, a dress she had worn to a fair when she was 16, the first time she had seen this house, arriving as a young bride and thinking it the largest house she had ever been inside. Bess remembered her mother saying, near the very end, in this room, in this light, "It's a good house, Bess. It's looked after us. You look after it now." She had taken this, at the time, as her mother's way of handing over the practical responsibilities, the dairy, the kitchen, the running of the household, all of which had fallen to Bess in the years that followed, at first alongside her mother's instruction, and then, after, alone. Standing in the room now, 20 years later, on the last morning, she understood it differently. Her mother had not been talking about chores. She had been talking about this morning, this kind of morning, the kind where you stand in a room and feel the whole weight of everyone who has ever stood in it before you, and you have to decide what to do with that weight, carry it or set it down, or find some way of doing both. Look after it, not keep it running. Look after it, the way you look after a person, with attention, with the specific quality of noticing that meant you saw what was actually there, not just what needed doing. Bess had looked after it. For 20 years, she had looked after it, and now the looking after was ending, not because she had failed at it, but because the world outside the house, the prices of wheat and wool, the debts accumulated through years of bad harvests and worse markets, the whole vast impersonal machinery of a country where farms like Greenhollow were failing by the dozen across every county, had simply overtaken what one woman's attention could hold against. She had not failed. She wanted, standing in this room, to be entirely clear with herself about that. She had not failed her mother's instruction. The world had simply become too large for the instruction to be enough. She stood at the window a little longer. Then she went to her own room, the smaller room, the one she had grown up in, the one with the door frame. But she did not look at the frame yet. Not yet. Her own room was small. It had always been small. Even when she was a child, it had felt small, though as a child, this had not seemed like a deficiency, simply like the size a room was. And it held, now, very little. The narrow bed, stripped to its frame, the small chest of drawers, empty, the single chair by the window where she had sat to do her sewing for 50 years, in every kind of light, through every season, the chair worn smooth on its arms where her hands had rested. She sat in the chair now. It fit her. Of course it fit her. She had been sitting in it her entire life. It had been made, in some sense, by her sitting in it. The wood worn into the shape of her over 50 years, the way the pump handle had been worn into the shape of every hand that had gripped it. She put her hands on the arms of the chair in the worn places and felt how exactly they fit, how the smoothness under her palms matched the shape of her palms, as though the chair had been carved for her, though it had not. It was simply an old chair that had belonged to the house long before she was born, and she had simply sat in it long enough, consistently enough, that it had agreed, the way the pump handle had agreed, to become hers. The window beside the chair looked north, over the kitchen garden toward the orchard, a different view from her parents' room, a smaller view closer in, the wall of the garden and the apple trees beyond it, and, in the distance, just visible, the line of the down where the sheep had grazed until the spring, when the last of the flock had gone too. She had sat in this chair as a child, doing the small sewing tasks her mother set her, hemming, mending, the endless small repairs that a household required, and she had sat in it as a young woman, and she had sat in it these last 20 years in the evenings after her father had gone to bed, doing the same kind of work by candlelight, or later by the lamp her brother Walter had sent from Canada one Christmas. A good lamp, better than anything else in the house, that had arrived with a letter saying, "Thought of you working in the evenings, Bess. Hope this helps the light reach further. The lamp was downstairs now, packed with the few things she was taking with her. It would go with her to the cottage in Ashkam, the small cottage, 2 rooms and a garden, that she had arranged to take, with what little remained after the debts were settled, from a Mrs. Pollard, whose husband had died the previous year, and who was glad of a sensible tenant. 2 rooms. After this house, after 52 years in a house with a kitchen and a scullery and a dairy and a pantry and 3 bedrooms and an attic and a yard and a garden and an orchard, all of it hers in the sense that mattered, the sense of knowing every inch of it in her hands and feet and the muscles of her back. 2 rooms. She sat in the chair by the window and let herself feel, for a moment, the size of the change. Not just the house, the whole shape of her life narrowing. Then she thought, the lamp will still light a room for me to sew in. The chair. She could not take the chair. It belonged to the house, to whoever bought the house. But she had a chair, a perfectly good chair, in the cottage already, left by Mrs. Pollard's late husband, sturdy enough. It would not be this chair. It would not fit her the way this chair fit her. But she would sit in it in the evenings with the lamp Walter had sent. And over time, she understood this now, sitting in the old chair for what she knew was nearly the last time. Over time, the new chair would begin to fit her too. Not the same way, but some way. She sat for a few minutes longer. Then she stood, and the old chair behind her held for a moment the warmth of her, the way it always had, the way it would not, after today, ever again. She went to the 3rd bedroom, the room that had been her brother's room. Robert and Walter, 3 and 6 years younger than Bess, respectively, both gone to Canada now. Robert to a farm near a place called Guelph, and Walter further west, to land he had described in his letters as so flat you could see the curve of the earth at the edges of it, which Bess had found when she first read it. Almost impossible to imagine, having never in her life been anywhere she could not see a hill. Bess had been 3 when Robert was born, and 6 when Walter came, 3 years later, too young in both cases to remember a household without them, so that for as long as she could properly remember anything, there had been the 3 of them, herself and the 2 younger brothers who had, for the whole of their childhood, been very much each other's company, in the particular way of siblings close enough in age to share everything and far enough apart from their elder sister that Bess had occupied almost from the start, something closer to a second pair of watching adult eyes than another child underfoot. The room was larger than Bess's own had been, befitting 2 boys rather than 1 girl, with 2 narrow beds that had been pushed together at some point in her brother's childhood and never separated, again because they had liked, apparently, sleeping close. 2 boys 4 years apart who had been, for the whole of their childhood, nearly inseparable, and who had left within 2 years of each other. Robert first, at 20, and Walter following at 19, for a country neither of them had seen, because the farm could not support 3 families, and there was, even then, before the worst of it, a sense that the land was not going to get easier, only harder. Bess had been 23 when Robert left, 25 when Walter followed. She remembered both departures with the particular clarity of things that mark the edges of a life. The carts to the station at Sherborne, The trunks, her mother's face, which had been composed in the way her mother's face was always composed, and which Bess had understood, even at 16, to be composed at considerable cost. She had not seen either brother since. There had been letters, regular at first, from Robert especially, who wrote a good clear hand and described his new life with the specific detail of someone trying to make a place real for people who would never see it. The size of the sky, he had written once. You cannot imagine the size of the sky here, Bess. It makes England feel like a room with the curtains half drawn. The letters had continued, though less frequently as the years went on, as new lives took up the space that old lives had occupied, as marriages happened. Both brothers had married Canadian women Bess had never met and never would, and children were born, nieces and nephews. Bess knew only as names and occasional photographs, small stiff studio portraits of children in their Sunday clothes, growing up in a country she would never see. She had written to both brothers about their father's death. She had received already a letter back from Robert. It had arrived just yesterday, in fact, the timing almost unbearable, full of grief and guilt and the particular helplessness of someone too far away to do anything except feel things at a distance. He had written about the sale too, about Greenhollow being lost, and he had written, I think of that house more than I can say, Bess. I think of the room Walter and I shared, and the window, and the elms. I'm sorry you have had to bear all of this alone. I wish I could have been there. I wish there was something I could do. There was nothing he could do. There had been nothing anyone could do for some years now. The debts had accumulated past the point where any single year's good harvest could have rescued them, and there had been no good harvest, not for years. The agricultural depression that had been working its way through the whole of England, like a slow illness finally arriving this year at Greenhollow's door. Bess stood in her brother's old room and looked at the two narrow beds, pushed together, stripped now, and thought about two boys who had slept here, who had whispered to each other in the dark the way brothers do, who had grown up in this room and left it for a country with a sky too large to imagine, and who would, both of them, receive a letter from her in some months' time. Letters took a long time to cross the ocean, telling them that the house itself was gone too, sold to strangers, the room they remembered now belonging to someone else's children. She thought, I will have to describe this morning to them somehow. Not everything, but something. They should know that someone walked through at the end, that it wasn't simply locked up and left. She did not yet know what she would say, but she thought she would find the words in time, the way she had found words for her father's death and her mother's all those years ago. You found the words because the people who needed them were waiting across whatever distance for whatever could be sent. And now there was nothing left on the landing except the door frame. Bess went back out onto the landing, where the light was fully grey gold now, the sun not yet risen but close, the window at the end of the landing filling with the particular colour that comes just before sunrise. Not yet warm, but no longer cold, a colour that seemed to be holding its breath. The door frame of her own room, the smaller bedroom, the one she had just left, faced the landing, and on its right-hand side, at the height of a child's head, and rising year by year toward the height of an adult's, were the marks. She had known they were here. Of course she had known. She had lived with this door frame her entire life, had walked past these marks every day for 52 years, had stopped really seeing them at all, the way you stop seeing anything that has always been there. But this morning, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she looked at them properly. They went back further than her own childhood. The earliest marks, faint now, the pencil gone soft and grey with age, some of them barely visible, except as a slight disturbance in the wood's grain, where a blade had once, very lightly, scored a line beneath a pencil mark to make it permanent, were dated in a hand she did not recognize, in the 1820s. J.T., age 4, 1822. J.T.T., age 6, 1824. J.T., her father, James Tarrant, age 4, age 6. A small boy in this house, 67 years ago, standing against this doorframe while someone, his own mother, presumably, Bess's grandmother, whom Bess had never known, made a small pencil mark above his head and wrote the date. There were more of his marks, climbing the frame through the 1820s and into the 30s. J.T. 8, J.T. 10, J.T. 13. A long gap here, Bess noted, between 13 and the next mark, which was dated 1835 and marked simply J.T. 17, the mark of a young man nearly done with growing. The line close to the top of where the marks went, close to where, presumably, James Tarrant had stopped growing altogether, and the marking had stopped, because there was no more to mark. And then Bess had to look closely to see this, because the marks here were different, a different hand, and lower on the frame, starting again near the bottom. Her father's children, her own marks, and her brother's. R.T. 3, 1843. W.T. 3, 1846. Robert and Walter, each marked at 3 years old, in their father's hand now. James Tarrant, the boy who had been measured by his own mother 60 years before, now measuring his own sons, in the same place, on the same frame. And lower still, among the lowest marks on the whole frame, the earliest of the 3 children's marks, made before either of her brothers had a mark of their own to compare against. E.T. 3, 1840. Elizabeth Tarrant, herself, age 3. The mark so low on the frame that Bess, standing now, had to crouch to bring her eyes level with it, had to fold herself down toward the floor, the way she had folded down at the hearth this morning, her body once again performing a shape it had not performed in decades, except that this shape was not one her body remembered from use. It was a shape her body had never had cause to make before, because she had never, in 52 years, crouched down to look at her own earliest mark. E.T. 3, 1840, 49 years ago. A line, faint, in pencil gone soft with age, marking the height of a 3-year-old girl who would grow up in this house, would watch her brothers leave it, would nurse her mother in it and her father after, would keep its dairy and its kitchen and its hearth for 50 years, and would, on a September morning in 1889, crouch on this landing in the grey light before sunrise and put her fingers, she did so now, very lightly, against the mark that recorded the very first measured moment of her own life. She stayed crouched there for a long time. The marks continued upward from her own earliest one, E.T. 4, 1841, E.T. 5, 1842, each one a year, each one a small pencil line and a date, climbing the door frame the way she had climbed, year by year, toward whatever height she would eventually reach. She traced them upward with her eyes, not touching now, just looking, reading her own childhood the way you might read a column of figures, except that these figures were inches and years, and they added up to something that no sum could quite capture. ET 6 18 43. The year, she now realized, doing the small mental arithmetic without quite meaning to. The year her brother Walter was 3, and marked at 3, 1846. No, that was wrong, she corrected herself. Walter's mark said 1846, which meant he was born in 1843, the same year as this mark of her own at 6. She sat with this for a moment. The strange vertigo of finding, in marks on a doorframe, the actual chronology of her family's life, laid out in a column of pencil lines, more honest in its way than any memory, because memory rearranged things, smoothed things. But the door frame simply recorded, this is when this happened, and this is how tall everyone was when it did. E.T. 9, 1846, the year Walter was 3, marked low on the frame, and Bess herself 9, marked considerably higher, a 9-year-old girl and a 3-year-old brother in the same house in the same year. And Bess found that she could remember this, not the marking itself, but the year, the particular year when Walter had been a small, solid, toddling presence in the kitchen, and Bess had been old enough to be given small tasks, to feel, for the first time, useful. E.T. 12, 1849. E.T. 14, 1851. The marks slowed as she got older, fewer of them, the gaps between widening, the way growth itself slows in adolescence, each year adding less than the year before, until E.T. 16, 1853. This was the last mark. The line was higher than all the others, nearly as high as her father's final mark from 1835, though not quite, and there was nothing above it. No 17, no 18. The marking simply stopped, the way it had stopped for her father at 17, because there was nothing more to record. She had reached, at 16, more or less the height she would be for the rest of her life, and the practice of marking, which had, presumably, felt important when there was something changing to record, had simply ended, the way such practices end, without anyone deciding to end them, simply because the thing they were tracking had finished happening. 16, 1853, 36 years ago. Bess crouched on the landing with her fingers near the lowest mark, E.T. 3, 1840, and her eyes on the highest, E.T. 16, 1853, and felt the whole span of it, a column of pencil lines representing 13 years of a child becoming the person she would be, recorded by. She assumed it had been her mother, doing the marking year after year, the small annual ritual of standing a child against a doorframe and making a mark and writing a date, a ritual repeated for each of 3 children across decades, until all 3 had stopped growing and the doorframe had become, without anyone planning it, a record of an entire family's childhood. And after today, she thought, after today someone would paint this doorframe, or strip it, or replace it, or simply not notice it at all, the way she had not noticed it, really, for years, and the marks would be gone, the way most things were eventually gone. Not through any violence, just through the ordinary process of a house becoming, gradually, someone else's, with someone else's marks if they made any, and someone else's children, if there were any, and no record at all of JT and RT and WT and ET, 3 children and their father before them. 67 years of a family measured in pencil on a doorframe, about to become invisible. She stayed crouched there, in the grey gold light, for a long time. When she finally stood, her knees protesting properly now, the crouch having been a long one, the light on the landing had changed. The sun was up, or nearly. The window at the end of the landing was full of warm gold light, the first direct sunlight of the day, and it fell across the floor in a long, bright rectangle that reached almost to where she stood. She thought about the attic. The attic at Greenhollow was reached by the steep, narrow stair at the end of the landing. Barely a stair at all, more a ladder with treads, the kind of access that required a particular care, especially going down, and Bess had used it perhaps a dozen times in the last 20 years, mostly to retrieve or store the kind of things that accumulate in a house and need somewhere to go that isn't quite throwing them away. She climbed it now. The attic was a long, low space under the roof, lit by 2 small windows at either gable end, and it held, she saw, as her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light up here, considerably less than she had expected. Most of it had been gone through already, in the difficult sorting weeks after her father's death. The broken furniture sold for what little it would bring. The genuinely useless things, finally, after decades of being kept in case, disposed of. What remained was a scatter of smaller things. An old cradle, its rockers cracked, that had presumably held all 3 Tarrant children in their turn, and possibly James Tarrant, himself before them, and his father before that. Nobody had ever been quite sure how old it was, only that it had always been in the attic, brought down for each new baby and returned afterward, an object that existed entirely in the gaps between use. A box of old curtains, too worn to be of use, kept anyway, the way fabric was always kept, because fabric could always become something else. Quilting, patching, the endless reuse that thrift required, and that Bess, looking at the box now, understood she would not be the one to do, because there was no longer a household large enough to need quilts made from old curtains, just 2 rooms in Ashkam and 1 woman living in them. And in the corner nearest the eastern gable, where the morning light was coming in now, strong and gold, through the small window, a stack of old slates, the kind children had once used for lessons before paper became cheap enough for everyday schoolwork, and on top of the stack a child's primer, its cover gone soft and the corners worn round, the kind of book that had been read by small fingers turning pages over and over. Bess picked it up. The cover read, in faded gilt lettering, the mother's primer. She opened it. On the flyleaf, in a careful, careful hand, the hand of someone writing very slowly, very deliberately, the way children write when writing is still new and effortful, were the words, "This book belongs to Elizabeth Tarrant, age 6. Her own hand, her own name, age 6, 1843. The same year, she realized, as the door frame mark she had just been looking at downstairs, ET 6, 1843. The same year, recorded twice, once in pencil on a doorframe, marking how tall she had grown, and once in ink in the front of a book, marking that she had learned to write her own name. She sat down on the floor of the attic, in the gold morning light, from the small window, with the primer in her lap, and turned the pages. The primer was full of the small marks of a child's use. Not just her own, she realized, as she turned the pages, but here and there, in different hands and different inks, the marks of her brothers too, who must have used the same book after her, or before her, or alongside her, the way books were passed between siblings in households where books were not plentiful. On one page, in the margin beside a passage about the months of the year, someone had written, in a child's uneven hand, "Robert says December is best because of Christmas, but I think it is May because of the lambs." This was not signed, but Bess recognized, looking at it, her own much younger handwriting. Not the careful, flyleaf signature, but the looser, faster hand of a child writing for herself. An opinion recorded in the margin of a lesson book, because the lesson book happened to be there and the opinion happened to need recording. May, because of the lambs. She remembered this, not the writing of it, but the feeling behind it, the particular joy of lambing season, which fell at Greenhollow in the early spring, and which she had loved as a child with the whole-hearted, uncomplicated love that children have for things that are simply, straightforwardly good. New lambs in the field below the house, wobbling and curious, the ewes calling to them, the whole farm briefly full of a kind of busy, tender chaos that even a small girl could feel was important. There had been no lambs this spring. The flock had gone in the spring, before lambing, sold along with everything else that could be sold. And Bess had not, until this moment, sitting in the attic with a child's book in her lap, fully registered this as a loss in itself. Not just the loss of income, the loss of the flock as an asset, but the loss of an actual spring, the spring she had loved best as a child, the spring of new lambs in the field, which would not happen this year or any year after at Greenhollow. On another page, further into the book, a different hand. This one, she thought, might be Walter's, rounder and more careless, had drawn in the margin beside a passage about arithmetic a small sketch of what appeared to be a ship. Just a few lines, a hull, 2 masts, a flag. A child's drawing of a ship, drawn perhaps a dozen years before that same child would actually board one, bound for Canada, for a country with a sky too large to imagine. Bess looked at the small drawn ship for a long time. She thought, he didn't know. Whoever drew this, if it was Walter, and she thought it probably was, didn't know, couldn't have known, that one day he would actually sail on something like this, away from everything in a fauna, this book, this house, this door frame with its marks. He was just a boy, drawing a ship in the margin of his lesson book, because boys draw ships, because ships are interesting, because the mind wanders during arithmetic and looks for something to do with a pencil. And the ship he drew became, eventually, real. Not that ship, of course, but the kind of ship, the actual experience of standing on a deck and watching England disappear behind him, the margin doodle and the real departure, separated by a dozen years, connected by nothing except that they had both, in their different ways, come from the same boy, in the same house, with the same restlessness in him that would eventually carry him across an ocean. She closed the primer carefully. She held it in her lap for a moment. Then she thought, I will take this. This, at least, I can take. It's small, it's mine. It has all 3 of our marks in it, in a way the door frame doesn't, because the door frame stays here, but this can come with me. She set it aside, on top of the box of curtains, where she would remember to collect it before she left. She stayed in the attic a little longer, in the gold morning light, looking at the few other things that remained. Nothing else as significant as the primer, just the ordinary residue of a long-occupied house. A broken chair, too far gone, even for firewood apparently, since it was still here. A crate of empty bottles, the kind that had once held her mother's cordials. A roll of canvas that might once have been a sail or a tarpaulin, or simply a large piece of canvas kept because canvas, like fabric, could always become something else. The light coming through the eastern gable window had strengthened considerably. Full sunrise now, the first proper sunlight of the day, and it came across the attic floor in a long, warm band that lit the dust in the air, made it visible. Thousands of small particles drifting in the gold light, the accumulated dust of decades, disturbed now by her presence, after who knew how long undisturbed. She watched the dust for a moment, the way it moved, slow and random, in the column of light, neither rising nor falling, but simply suspended, drifting, and thought, this is what's left, in the end, of a house this old. Dust. The accumulated small particles of everything that's ever happened in it, skin and fabric, and the slow decay of wood and plaster, all of it breaking down over centuries into this, motes of dust, drifting in a beam of light, visible only because the light happens to catch them at this particular moment. In 100 years, she thought, this dust will be different dust, new dust, from new decades, new lives. But some of this dust, some tiny fraction of these particular motes drifting in this particular light, might still be here, might have settled into some corner, undisturbed, and might still, in some infinitesimal way, be part of what this attic is. It was not a sad thought, exactly. It felt sitting there in the gold light with the primer in her lap and the dust drifting around her, more like a comfort, the idea that nothing, not really, entirely disappeared. It just became smaller and quieter and mixed in with everything else, the way a single voice becomes part of a chorus, indistinguishable but present. She got up eventually. Her knees, again, told her about it. She picked up the primer from where she'd set it on the curtain box, and she went back to the narrow stair and climbed down, carefully, the way the stair required, back to the landing, where the door frame stood in full morning light now, the marks on it clearly visible, every pencil line distinct in the strong gold light from the window. She looked at them once more. Then she went down the main stairs, the third step creaking once more under her weight, to begin the rooms below. The front parlour at Greenhollow was a room that had, in Bess's lifetime, been used relatively rarely. It was the room for visitors, for Sundays, for the small, formal occasions that a farming household observed. The parson's visits, the rare arrival of relations from further afield. The occasions, increasingly few in recent years, when the family dressed in their better clothes and sat in this room with its better furniture and conducted itself according to a slightly different, slightly more careful set of rules than governed the kitchen. It had a particular quality, this room, that Bess had always associated with formality and a little with discomfort. Not unpleasant discomfort, just the discomfort of a room kept for occasions, a room that did not quite belong to the daily rhythm of the house the way the kitchen did, a room that was, in some sense, on its best behavior and required you to be on yours. The window here faced south, over the garden, and the morning light coming through it now was different from the gold grey of the east-facing rooms, softer, more general, the light of a room that received the sun later in the day and was, even now, in full morning, still somewhat in shadow relative to the rooms Bess had already visited. The furniture remained, the good chairs, the small table, the cabinet in the corner that had held, for as long as Bess could remember, the household's few pieces of good china, brought out only for the occasions this room was used for. The cabinet was empty now. The china had been part of what was sold in the careful sorting after her father's death to people in the village who had wanted it and could pay something for it. Small sums that had gone, like everything else, toward the debts. Bess stood in the middle of the room and felt, more than in any other room so far, the particular quality of a room becoming a stranger to itself. The kitchen, the dairy, her own bedroom. These rooms had been so thoroughly hers, so completely worn into the shape of her daily life, that even empty, even on this last morning, they still felt, in some essential way, occupied by the grooves she had worn into them, the marks her body had left. But this room had never quite been hers in that way. It had been the family's, in a more formal sense. The room where the Tarrants presented themselves to the world, where occasions were marked, where a certain kind of dignity was maintained. And now, with the china gone and the room empty of any occasion to come, it felt, she searched for the word, provisional, as though it had always been, in some sense, waiting for an occasion, and the occasions had simply stopped, and the room was still waiting, not quite understanding that the waiting was over. She thought about her parents in this room, her mother in her good dress on a Sunday, pouring tea for the parson, her father ill at ease in his good coat, the way farming men often were in rooms meant for sitting rather than working, his hands looking too large and too red for the delicate cups. She thought about herself as a girl, sitting very straight on one of the good chairs, told to be quiet and polite while the adults talked, looking out the south window at the garden and wishing she were outside in it. She walked to the window now and looked out at the garden, the kitchen garden walled, with its beds laid out in the pattern that had been laid out, she believed, by her grandmother, and maintained with only minor adjustments ever since. The beds were in their late season state, the summer vegetables mostly cleared, the autumn ones, the last of the cabbages, the leeks standing in their rows, still in the ground, because someone would need to harvest them, though it would not now be her. She thought, I planted those leeks in the spring when I still believed, or wanted to believe, that this year might be different. I planted them the way I've planted leeks every spring for 20 years, in the same bed, in the same way. And they grew the way they always grow. And now they're ready, and I won't be the one to dig them. She did not know who would dig them. Whoever bought the farm, presumably, or whoever they hired to work it, if they hired anyone, if the new owners intended to farm it at all, which was not certain. Land like this, struggling land, sometimes went to people who wanted it for other reasons, for the house alone, for some version of country living that did not actually involve farming. Either way, the leeks she had planted would be harvested this autumn, by someone else's hands. The work of her spring would become someone else's autumn, without any thread connecting the two, except the leeks themselves, growing in the ground, indifferent to whose hands had planted them or whose hands would pull them up. She stood at the window for a while longer. Then she went to the next room, her father's study. He had called it that, though it was a small room, barely more than a closet really, off the front parlour, with space for a desk and a single chair and a wall of shelves that held the farm's accounts going back in various ledgers for longer than Bess had been alive. This room, more than any other, was the room of the last difficult years. This was where her father had sat in the evenings, going over the figures, trying to find some arrangement of numbers that would make the farm's situation different from what it actually was, and failing because the numbers were what they were, and no amount of careful arrangement could change a harvest that hadn't come in, or prices that had fallen, or debts that had accumulated past any single year's capacity to address. Bess had sat with him some of those evenings in the second chair. There was a second chair, a plain hard chair brought in from elsewhere, because the study had not been built for two people. But in the last years, her father had wanted her there, while he went over the figures, not because she could help with the figures particularly, but because, she thought, he had not wanted to be alone with them. The ledgers were still here, on the shelves. They would go to the solicitor eventually, part of the settling of the estate, but for now they remained, their spines worn, their pages, she knew without opening them, full of her father's careful handwriting recording, year after year, the slow arithmetic of a farm's decline, the good years becoming less good, the less good years becoming bad, the bad years becoming, finally, impossible. She did not open any of them. She had seen enough of those figures in the evenings of the last years, sitting in the hard chair while her father's pen moved down columns and his face, in the lamplight, took on the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he did not want to be doing. What she looked at, instead, was the desk itself, and on the desk, in the exact center where her father had always kept it, a small framed photograph, her mother, taken some 30 years ago, in the formal stiff style of photographs from that period, sitting very upright, her hands folded in her lap. Looking at the camera with an expression that was trying, Bess could see even now, not to look as nervous as she clearly felt, because having one's photograph taken had been, in those days, a significant and slightly alarming event. Her father had kept this photograph on his desk for 30 years. Through all the evenings of figures, through all the slow accumulating difficulty of the last years, her mother's face, 30 years younger than she had been when she died, captured in that one nervous formal moment, had looked out from the desk, and Bess wondered, standing here now, how many times her father had looked up from the ledgers, from the impossible arithmetic, and looked at that face instead. She picked up the photograph. She would take this too. It belonged to her, in the sense that mattered more than almost anything else in the house. It was the only photograph of her mother that existed, taken on a single occasion 30 years ago, when a traveling photographer had come through Ashkam, and the family had, in a rare extravagance, paid for the sitting. She held it for a moment, her mother's face, young, nervous, trying to be composed, looking out from 30 years ago into this room, into this last morning, into Bess's hands. Then she set it carefully into her coat pocket, beside the key she had not needed, and she left the study and closed the door behind her, not because it needed closing, but because it felt somehow like the right thing to do. To leave that room, the room of the last hard years, closed, the way you close a door on something that is finished. She went back through the kitchen and out the back door into the yard. The morning was fully arrived now, the sun well up, the September air still cool, but with the particular quality of a day that would be warm later. A last good day, perhaps, before the autumn properly set in. The yard was swept as she had left it, the cobbles still slightly damp with overnight dew, and across it the building stood in the strengthening light. The barn, the stable, the cart shed, the various structures that had supported the farm's working life for as long as anyone could remember. Bess stood in the middle of the yard and turned slowly, taking it in. The house behind her, long and grey gold in the morning light, smoke not rising from its chimney for the first time in living memory. The barn, ahead, its great doors closed. The stable to the right, empty, its door standing slightly open onto darkness. The cart shed beyond, where the cart itself still stood, because the cart, unlike the horses that had pulled it, had not yet found a buyer and would go this afternoon into the auction along with everything else. She walked toward the barn first. The barn doors were heavy, and she had to put her shoulder into the left one, the way she always had. The door dragged slightly on its bottom hinge, had dragged for years, and required a particular shove, angled just so to swing it clear. And it opened onto the familiar dimness, the smell of old hay and dust, and the particular cool stillness of a large empty space. The barn was nearly empty now. The hay that remained from this year's reduced harvest, what little there had been, stood in a single stack at the far end, far smaller than the stacks Bess remembered from her childhood, when the barn had been full to the rafters by this time of year. The whole vast space packed with the summer's gathering. She walked into the dimness, her feet finding the familiar uneven floor. Packed earth, worn smooth in places by decades of cartwheels and animal hooves and human feet. The same floor her father had walked, and his father, the same floor that had received the harvests of 100 years or more, good years and bad, the whole accumulated weight of everything this land had ever produced, passing through this space on its way to wherever it went next, to market, to the household, to the animals that depended on it. The light came through the gaps in the barn's siding in long, bright lines, falling across the floor and the small remaining haystack in stripes, and dust moved in the lines of light the way it had moved in the attic, the same drifting motes, the same slow random suspension, the accumulated dust of 100 years of harvests, disturbed now by her walking through it. She stood in the middle of the barn in the striped light and thought about the harvests this barn had held, the good years when the whole space had been full, when the smell of new hay had been so strong it seemed to be a kind of weather, a condition of the air itself. And the recent years, the thin years, when the stack at the end had grown smaller and smaller, until this year's stack, which she could see now in full daylight, was barely a stack at all, more a heap, really, the produce of a single difficult summer on land that had given everything it reasonably could and had finally not been enough. The barn had held 100 years of harvests. It would not, after today, hold any more, or it would, but they would not be Tarrant harvests, would not be the produce of land worked according to the particular knowledge her father and grandfather had accumulated about it, which fields drained well, and which held water, which slopes caught the frost first, which corners the rabbits favoured and needed extra fencing. That knowledge, like the knowledge in her hands and feet about the house, would not transfer. It would simply end here, with her, the last person who carried it, and whoever farmed this land next would have to learn it again, the slow way, the way knowledge of land is always learned, by working it season after season, until the land itself teaches you what it needs. She walked back out of the barn into the full morning sun and pulled the door closed behind her, the same shove, angled the same way, the door dragging on its hinge and then settling, with a soft, heavy sound, into place. The stable was next, and this was harder than the barn had been. Harder because the stable, unlike the barn, had been recently occupied. The horses sold only in the spring, and the space still held, faintly, the smell of them, the warm animal smell of horse and hay and leather that lingers in a stable long after the horses themselves are gone, fading slowly, week by week, but not yet entirely faded. There had been 2 horses for most of Bess's life, a heavy horse for the plough and the cart, and a lighter one, a cob that had been used for the trap, for trips into Ashkam and beyond. The heavy horse, the most recent one, had been called Duke, a placid, enormous creature that Bess had known for 15 years, had gone to a farm 2 parishes over, sold along with most of the working equipment in the spring sale that had preceded today's larger one, the sale of the smaller things before the sale of everything. Bess walked into the stable and stood in Duke's stall, empty now, the manger empty, but still showing on its edges the marks of 15 years of a horse's teeth and lips worrying at the wood, the particular wear that comes from an animal's daily habits, repeated until the wood itself bears the record. She put her hand on the edge of the manger, where the wood was worn smooth and slightly hollowed, and thought about Duke, his particular smell, the warm, solid weight of him, the way he had always turned his head when she came into the stable in the mornings, not with any great excitement. Duke had not been a horse given to excitement, but with a kind of placid acknowledgement, as though to say, "Ah, yes, you again, good." She had cried a little when Duke went, not dramatically, just a few tears, standing in this stable, watching him led away by the man who'd bought him, Duke himself entirely unconcerned, plodding off toward his new situation with the same placid acceptance he brought to everything. He would be fine, she had told herself. He was the kind of horse who would be fine anywhere, as long as there was a manger to worry at and someone to bring him hay. But the stall remained, with its worn manger, its particular smell fading, and Bess understood, standing in it now, that this, even more than the barn, even more than most of the house, was a space defined entirely by an absence. The barn, even nearly empty, still held this year's hay, still functioned in some reduced way as a barn, but the stable held nothing except the fading evidence of what it had held, and the marks, like the marks on the doorframe, like the worn pump handle, like the smooth arms of her sewing chair, that the held thing had left behind. Marks of use, marks of presence. The whole farm, she thought, standing in the empty stable in the strengthening morning light, was made of these marks. Places where living things, people and animals both, had pressed against the world long enough and consistently enough that the world had given way a little, had taken an impression, had agreed to remember. And all of these marks, the door frame, the pump handle, the worn manger, the smooth chair arms, the creaking step, all of them would remain physically in the house and its buildings, regardless of who owned them. But the meaning of the marks, what they recorded, who had made them, why, that meaning existed only in Bess, only in her memory. And when she left this afternoon, the marks would remain, but the meaning would go with her, and the house would become, in an important sense, illegible, full of evidence of lives it could no longer account for. She left the stable. She did not look back at it. She walked next into the kitchen garden, through the gate in the wall, which stood open as it generally did during the working day, closed only in winter against the worst of the wind. The garden in late September was at its particular autumnal stage. The summer's abundance past its peak, but not yet finished, the beds showing the mixture of late produce and early decline that marked this turning point in the year. The leeks she had thought of earlier stood in their row, dark green and sturdy, ready for harvest. The last of the runner beans hung on their poles, some pods past their best, gone tough and stringy, others still good. The cabbages sat in their bed, solid and pale, a few of them showing the first nibbles of the slugs that always, by this point in the season, found their way to whatever remained. Bess walked along the paths between the beds, paths she had walked, like everything else in this place, more times than could be counted, paths worn by her own feet and her mother's before her, and presumably her grandmother's before that. 3 generations of women walking the same routes between the same beds, planting and tending and harvesting according to a rhythm that repeated year after year, with only the small variations that weather and circumstance imposed. At the far end of the garden, against the south wall, was the herb bed. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, sage, the same plants whose dried versions hung in the pantry, growing here in their living forms. The lavender past its flowering now, but still holding its shape. The rosemary evergreen and sturdy, the kind of plant, as Bess had thought earlier, that simply did not die, only spread. She crouched beside the rosemary bush, the same crouch, knees out, that she had performed at the hearth and on the landing, her body's habitual way of getting close to something at ground level, and put her hand on it, feeling the particular texture of rosemary, the small needle-like leaves, slightly resinous, the smell rising immediately at the touch, sharp and clean, and instantly, completely familiar. This rosemary bush, she had been told as a child, had grown from a cutting taken from an even older bush, which had itself grown from a cutting, going back. Nobody knew quite how far, but far generations of rosemary, each plant a continuation of the one before, none of them, in the strict sense, the original bush, but all of them, in another sense, the same plant, continuously alive, continuously present in this corner of this garden for longer than anyone could say. She thought, I could take a cutting. The thought arrived simply, practically. Rosemary struck easily from cuttings. Everyone knew that. You simply cut a piece, strip the lower leaves, put it in water or directly into soil, and more often than not, it took root and grew. She could take a cutting of this rosemary, this plant that had been growing in this spot in some continuous form for longer than her family had owned the farm, perhaps, for all she knew, longer than the house itself had stood, and plant it in the small garden at the cottage in Ashkam, and it would grow there, the same plant, continuing in a new place. The unbroken thread that had been growing in this corner for generations. It would not be the same as the farm. It would not be the same as any of it. The kitchen, the dairy, the door frame with its marks, the whole vast accumulated weight of a house and its history. But it would be something, a living thing, continuing, carried from one place to another, the way living things sometimes were, deliberately, by people who understood that some things were worth carrying even when most things could not be carried at all. She took out the small knife she carried, as she always did, in her apron pocket. Though she was not wearing her apron this morning, she had transferred the knife out of habit to her coat pocket, along with the key and now the photograph, and she cut, carefully, a good strong piece of new growth from the rosemary bush, 6 inches or so, the kind of cutting that took best. She held it in her hand. It smelled, immediately and completely, of itself. That sharp, clean rosemary smell, rising from the cut end, filling the morning air around her. She would wrap it in a damp cloth when she got back to the kitchen to keep it fresh until she could plant it. It was a small thing, but it was alive, and it would go with her. And in the cottage garden in Ashkam, in time, it would grow and become eventually its own bush, and someone, herself, or whoever came after her, because gardens outlasted gardeners too, would one day take a cutting from it, and the thread would continue. She stood, with the rosemary cutting in her hand, and looked back at the house, long and grey gold in the strengthening sun, the kitchen window catching the light, the chimney still without smoke. She had perhaps half an hour left. She went to the orchard last, before going back inside. The orchard at Greenhollow was small, a dozen trees or so, apples mostly, with 2 pears and a single old plum that produced, most years, a modest crop that went into the preserves Bess had been looking at earlier in the pantry. The trees were old, most of them, older than Bess, certainly, and the oldest, the apple by the gate that her grandfather had supposedly planted in the year of Waterloo, was older than anyone now living could verify, its trunk thick and gnarled and somewhat hollow on one side, but still, every year producing apples, smaller now than they had once been, but still apples, still good for cooking, if not for eating fresh. Bess walked among the trees in the morning light, the grass beneath them long and wet with dew. The early apples, the ones that ripened first in late August and September, already fallen in places, lying in the grass where they had dropped, some of them gone soft, attracting wasps in the warming air. She picked one up, a beauty of Bath, one of the early varieties, small and red-streaked, slightly bruised from its fall, but otherwise sound, and bit into it. The flesh was crisp and sharp, particular sweet tart flavor of an apple eaten straight from the tree, still cool from the night. And she stood in the orchard eating it, the juice running slightly onto her chin, the way she had eaten apples in this orchard her entire life, every September, the same trees, the same apples, the same particular taste of this particular orchard, which she understood now, biting into it, standing in the wet grass in the morning light. She might never taste again, because apples, unlike rosemary, did not travel well as cuttings that would fruit quickly. Grafting took years, and she did not have years, or rather, she did have years, presumably, ahead of her, but not years in which this orchard's particular trees, with their particular flavor, accumulated over generations of grafting and selection, would be available to her. This taste, this exact taste, this beauty of Bath from this tree in this orchard on this morning was, in a sense, ending, not dramatically. The tree would continue, would produce apples next year and the year after, for whoever owned it. But Bess would not be there to eat them, and the particular continuity, the fact that she had eaten apples from this tree every September for 52 years, that her mouth knew this taste, the way her hands knew the pump handle, and her feet knew the third stair. That continuity was ending this morning, with this apple, the last one in all likelihood that she would ever eat from this tree. She finished it slowly. She did not throw the core away carelessly. She carried it to the base of the tree and set it down in the grass the way she always had. An old habit, something to do with not wasting even the smallest thing. And also, she thought now, something to do with return. The apple came from the tree, and the core went back to the tree's roots, a small completion, a small circle. She stood under the old apple tree, her grandfather's tree, the Waterloo tree, as the family had always called it, and looked up into its branches where a few apples remained, high up, out of easy reach, the kind that were always left for the birds, or simply left because reaching them wasn't worth the trouble. For fruit that was, by this point in the season, mostly gone over. The light came through the branches in patches, the leaves beginning to turn at their edges, the first yellow showing among the green, the early sign of the season's actual turning, which would accelerate now through October into the full color of autumn, and then the bareness of winter. A cycle this tree had performed, Bess thought, perhaps 70 times, 70 autumns, 70 winters, 70 springs of blossom and summers of fruit, all of it watched for 52 of those years. By her. She thought, it doesn't know. The tree doesn't know that today is different from any other day. It will lose its leaves this autumn the way it always has, and it will blossom again in the spring, the way it always has, regardless of who is standing underneath it, regardless of whether anyone is standing underneath it at all. There was something in this, something that was not quite comfort, but was adjacent to comfort, a kind of perspective that came from standing under a tree that had outlived several human lifetimes already, and would, in all likelihood, outlive whatever happened to Greenhollow as a farm, as a name, as a Tarrant possession. The tree did not care about ownership. The tree simply continued, the way the rosemary continued, the way, in their different ways, all the living things on this farm continued, indifferent to the human dramas of death and sale and departure that played out, generation after generation, around them. She stood under the tree a little longer. Then she walked back toward the house. the rosemary cutting still in her hand. The morning now well advanced, the sun fully up, the day beginning in earnest. Though not for Greenhollow, the kind of day it had ever begun before. Back in the kitchen, she found a damp cloth. There was still water in the scullery from the pump. Though she had not worked the handle this morning, the water in the pipe simply standing, cool from whenever it had last been used days ago, and she wrapped the rosemary cutting carefully and set it, wrapped, into her coat pocket, alongside the photograph and the key. She looked at the kitchen one more time. The light was different now from when she had first come in. Fully morning, strong and clear, falling across the flagstone floor, across the worn path between door and hearth and table, across the cold hearthstone she had crouched beside 2 hours ago. 2 hours. She glanced at the small clock on the mantel. It still kept time, though no one would wind it after today, and it would stop eventually, sometime in the coming days, at whatever moment its spring finally ran down, and would remain stopped at that moment until someone, the new owners presumably, either wound it again or didn't. It said nearly 8. The clerk would arrive at 10. She had perhaps 2 hours, she had thought, when she set out, and she had used most of it, room by room, the way she had planned. But there was time still. Not much. Enough. She thought about the door frame. She had known since this morning, since before this morning really, since the solicitor had agreed to give her this time alone. She had known that the door frame was the center of it, the thing she had really come for, even if she had not let herself think of it in those terms, even if she had told herself and him that she simply wanted to walk through the rooms one last time. The marks on the door frame would not survive. She had understood this, crouching there earlier. The new owners would paint or strip or simply not notice, and in any case, the marks meant nothing without the names and dates that explained them. And even with the names and dates, they meant nothing without the people, without Bess herself, who was the only person left who could say, this is who these people were, this is what their lives were, this is why these marks matter. Without her, the marks were just marks, pencil lines on old wood, the kind of thing that exists in the corner of many old houses, noticed occasionally, explained to no one, eventually painted over or replaced. The small accumulated evidence of childhoods erased, the way most evidence of most childhoods is eventually erased, not through cruelty, just through time, through the ordinary process of houses changing hands and lives moving on. She went up the stairs, the third step creaking for the last time this morning under her weight, and stood once more on the landing in front of the door frame in the full, strong light of mid-morning. She had brought from the kitchen a stub of pencil. There were always pencils in the kitchen drawer for marking jars and writing notes, and she had taken one without quite deciding to. The way her hand had reached for the rosemary cutting and the photograph and the key. A series of small decisions made by some part of her that was working ahead of her conscious thought, preparing for something she had not yet, in words, decided to do. She stood in front of the door frame with the pencil in her hand. The marks went up the frame in their column. JT from the 1820s, climbing to 17 and stopping, RT and WT and ET, 3 children's growth recorded through the 40s and into the 50s. her own marks the lowest and the latest, climbing from 3 years old to 16, and then stopping in 1853, 36 years ago. There was space above her own highest mark, ET 16, 1853, space on the frame, going up toward the lintel that had never been used because by the time Bess was 16, she had reached more or less her full height, and there had been no reason to mark any higher because there was nothing higher to mark. But there was space. The frame continued upward, blank, for perhaps 8 or 10 inches above her last mark, before reaching the lintel itself. Bess stood very straight, the way she had not stood, perhaps, in years. The careless, slight stoop of 52 years of work and worry straightening out, deliberately, as she positioned herself against the frame the way she must have positioned herself as a child. All those years ago, her back against the wood, her head level, waiting for the pencil mark above her. There was no one to make the mark for her. Her mother was dead. Her father was dead. Her brothers were across an ocean. She was alone on this landing, on this last morning. And if the column of marks on this door frame was going to continue, if there was going to be one more mark, the mark that completed the record, the mark of the child grown into the woman who was now leaving, she would have to make it herself. She reached up with the pencil as high as she could reach while keeping her back against the frame and her head level, which required a slight stretch. Her arm extended above her own head, the pencil held at an angle that was awkward but manageable, and she made a small mark, a short horizontal line, at the height of the top of her own head. Then she stepped away from the frame and looked at what she had made. A line, just a line, fainter than the old marks, because the pencil was soft and her hand, reaching up and over, had not been entirely steady, but a line above all the others, completing the column that had begun with J.T., aged 4, 1822, 67 years ago, and had continued through 3 more children's growth, and had stopped for 36 years at E.T. 16, 1853, and now continued one more time with this final mark, made not by a parent measuring a child, but by the child herself, 52 years old, measuring the only thing left to measure, not how much she had grown, but simply that she had been here, that she had stood one more time against this frame, in this house, before leaving it. Beneath the mark she wrote, carefully, in the same soft pencil, E.T. 52, 1889. She stood back and looked at the whole column. 67 years of marks, 4 people, 3 generations in the strict sense. Her father's childhood, her own and her brother's, and now this final edition, her own again, an old mark and a new one from the same person, 66 years apart. And she thought, this is the only monument any of us will have. Not a gravestone. There were gravestones in the churchyard at Ashkam, for her parents and for earlier Tarrants, going back generations, proper stone monuments with names and dates, the kind of thing that endured in its way for centuries. But this column of pencil marks on a door frame, was different. The gravestones recorded that people had died, and when. This recorded that people had lived, had grown specifically, had been small and become larger, had stood against this frame year after year, while someone who loved them marked how much they'd changed. It was a record of childhood, of the specific tenderness of parents, marking their children's growth, a record that existed nowhere else, in no other form, because it was not the kind of thing anyone thought to preserve deliberately. It simply accumulated on a door frame, in a house, the way such things accumulate until the house itself was the only place it existed. And now she had added to it one more mark, the only adult mark in the whole column, made not in tenderness by a parent, but in something else, something she did not quite have a word for. Not grief exactly, and not defiance, but something like insistence. A refusal to let the column simply end at 16 in 1853, as though nothing had happened to that 16-year-old girl in all the years since. Something had happened. 36 years had happened. A whole life, nearly, lived in this house, and the column should reflect that, even if the reflection was just one more line, one more set of initials, one more date. She thought about what would happen to this door frame after today. The most likely outcome, she thought, was the one she had already considered: paint, or replacement, or simple inattention. The marks gone within a year or two. The new owners not even noticing they had been there, because why would they notice? They were just pencil lines, faint, on the side of a door frame in a child's bedroom, the kind of thing that existed, in some form, in the corner of 1,000 old houses and meant nothing to anyone except the families who had made them. But there was another possibility, a small one. She thought about it now, standing in front of the frame with the pencil still in her hand. She could leave a note. Not a note that explained everything. There was not time, and in any case some things could not be explained in a note. The whole weight of 67 years and 4 lives could not be reduced to a few lines of writing. But a note that said, simply, "These marks are real. These are real people who lived in this house and grew up in it and left it in one way or another. And these marks are what's left of that. Please don't paint over them. Or, if you must, if the frame needs replacing for some practical reason, please, at least, look at them first. Know that they were here." She did not know if it would work. She did not know if whoever found such a note, if anyone ever found it, would care, would understand, would do anything differently than they would have done anyway. People did what they needed to do with houses they bought. That was simply how it was, and Bess, of all people, understood this, because she was, this morning, doing exactly that kind of thing herself, leaving a house, taking what she could carry, leaving the rest to become whatever it would become in someone else's hands. But she could try. It cost nothing to try. And there was something in the trying itself, regardless of whether it worked, that felt, to her, like the right way to end this morning. Not just looking, not just remembering, but doing one small thing, leaving something behind, deliberately, for whoever came next, on the chance, the small chance, that it might matter to them too. She went back down to the kitchen to find paper. There was a drawer in the kitchen dresser where odd pieces of paper accumulated, the backs of old letters, torn off corners, the kind of paper that got kept because throwing away paper in a household like this had never quite seemed right. Not when paper could always be useful for something, a note, a list, a spill of ink that needed blotting. She found a piece that would do, the back of an old seed catalogue, blank on the reverse, large enough, and she sat at the kitchen table, in the chair that had been hers for 20 years, at the place that had been hers, and she thought for a moment about what to write. Then she wrote, "To whoever finds this," on the door frame of the smaller bedroom upstairs, the one that looks north over the garden. There are pencil marks recording the heights of children, going back to 1822. They are the growth marks of the Tarrant family, who lived in this house for at least 3 generations, and probably longer. The earliest marks, JT, are my father, James Tarrant, marked by his own mother from age 4 to age 17, between 1822 and 1835. The lower marks, RT, WT, ET, are my brothers Robert and Walter and myself, Elizabeth, marked by our mother from 1840 to 1853. The newest mark, the one above all the others, made this morning, the 24th of September, 1889, is mine. I am 52 years old. This is the last morning I will spend in this house. The farm has been sold, and I am leaving it to live in Ashkam. I do not ask you to keep these marks, if keeping them is inconvenient, or if the frame needs replacing for some practical reason. I only ask that you look at them before you decide. They represent 4 people's childhoods, or in my case, a childhood and the whole life that came after it. And I did not want them simply painted over without anyone knowing what they were. If you do choose to keep them, and if, in time, there are children in this house again, and you find yourself reaching up to mark how tall they've grown, there is space on the frame, above my mark, for more. The frame was made generously. There is room. Whoever you are, I hope you are happy here. It is a good house. It looked after us for a long time, and I hope it looks after you too. Elizabeth Tarrant, 24th September, 1889. She read it through once. She did not change anything. She folded it and went back upstairs and tucked it carefully into the gap behind the door frame, where the wood had pulled slightly away from the wall over the decades. A small gap, but enough to hold a folded piece of paper, hidden from casual view but not difficult to find, if anyone ever thought to look, or if anyone ever, in some future renovation, took the frame apart and found it then, however many years from now. She pressed it into place. She stood back. The door frame looked from the landing exactly as it had looked an hour ago. The same marks, the same wood, nothing visibly different except the new pencil line at the top, which someone would have to look closely to notice, the way Bess herself had stopped noticing for years until this morning. But there was a note now, hidden in the gap behind the wood. A small thing. Possibly nothing would come of it. Possibly it would sit there for decades, for longer than Bess's own life, and never be found, or be found by accident during some future repair, and read with mild curiosity, and then disposed of, the way old papers found in old houses often were. Or possibly, and this was the small chance she had decided was worth the trying, possibly someone would find it someday, and read it, and look at the marks, and understand for a moment that a house was not just a house, that it had been for 67 years at least, the place where a family's children grew up, measured year by year against a door frame, by people who loved them. She thought that was enough. It was, in any case, all she had time for. She went back downstairs for the last time. The light in the kitchen was full morning now. 9:30, she thought, though she did not check the clock again. She had stopped somewhere in the last hour, tracking the time precisely, trusting instead to the general sense of the morning's progress, the light strengthening, the particular quality of 9 o'clock versus 6 o'clock versus 8, which her body knew the way it knew everything else about this house without needing to consult a clock. She stood in the kitchen, in the worn path between door and hearth and table, and looked at the room one more time. The cold hearth, the long table, scrubbed clean. She had scrubbed it yesterday, the same instinct that had swept the yard and made the bed, the instinct toward forms observed even past their purpose. The window, with its view toward Ashkam, the church tower visible now in full daylight, small and pale against the green of the rise. She thought about everything she had seen this morning: the kitchen, the scullery, the dairy, the pantry, the passage with its uneven floor, the stairs with the creaking step, her parents' room and her own and her brother's, the attic with its dust and its primer, the parlour and the study with its photograph, the yard, the barn, the stable, the garden with its rosemary, the orchard with its apples. Every room had given her something, not an object, mostly, though she had 3 objects now in her coat pocket: the photograph, the rosemary cutting, the primer, which she had not yet collected from the attic and would need to fetch before she left. But more than objects, each room had given her back a piece of the house's memory of her, the body's memory, the marks that 52 years had made, and that she had, this morning, for the first time really, properly seen. She thought, I came here today to say goodbye to the house, but the house has been saying goodbye to me too, all morning, showing me, room by room, everything it remembers about me, everything my body has learned from it, and it has learned from my body. 67 years of marks and wear, and the particular shapes that living things and the places they live make in each other, given enough time. It was, she thought, a kind of conversation, not in words. Houses didn't speak, not literally, but in the language houses did speak, in worn stone and smoothed wood, in creaking steps and dragging doors, in the particular way light fell through particular windows at particular times of day, in the marks that bodies left on frames and handles and chair arms, the slow patient record of presence that a house kept, the only way a house could keep anything. And she had answered this morning, not in words either, mostly, except for the note behind the door frame. She had answered by walking through, by touching the pump handle and the rosemary and the worn manger, by sitting in the chair that fit her and crouching at the hearth that no longer needed tending, by adding her own mark to the column on the door frame. A conversation, 67 years on one side, 2 hours on the other, but a conversation nonetheless. The house telling her everything it remembered, and she, in the small ways available to her, telling it. I remember too. I was here. It mattered. She went back up to the attic one more time to fetch the primer. The light up here had changed again. Fuller now, the sun higher, the gold band across the floor narrower but brighter, the dust still drifting in it, the same dust, she supposed, or dust enough like it that the difference didn't matter. She picked up the primer from where she'd left it on the curtain box. She held it for a moment, looking at the soft worn cover, the faded gilt lettering, the mother's primer. She thought about her own mother, choosing this book. Or perhaps it had been chosen by an even earlier mother, her grandmother perhaps, and simply passed down. The way the cradle had been passed down, the way the rosemary had been passed down, things that outlasted the people who first acquired them and became, instead, part of what a family simply had, generation after generation, without anyone remembering exactly when or how they had first arrived. The Mother's Primer, a book for teaching children. But the title suggested something more than that, suggested a book that was itself, in some sense, an act of mothering, patient, repetitive, designed to be used again and again by each new child in turn, each one writing their name on the flyleaf in their careful new handwriting, each one adding, in the margins, their own small observations. May, because of the lambs, a ship drawn by a boy who would one day sail on one. She thought, I will keep this, not just for myself, though it was hers in the sense that mattered, the way the photograph and the rosemary cutting were hers, but because, she thought, standing in the attic with the primer in her hands, there might be a use for it beyond simply keeping it. She did not have children of her own. At 52 in 2 rooms in Ashkam, this was not a thing that was going to change. But there were, in the village, children, neighbours' children, the children of people she had known her whole life, who came sometimes to the cottage gardens for apples, or simply to visit, the way village children moved between houses with a freedom that was one of the genuine pleasures of small place life. She could read to them from this, not as a lesson, particularly. Children had proper schooling now, better than she'd had, but as a story, in the evenings, by the lamp Walter had sent. This is a book that belonged to me, when I was small, in the house where I grew up. And look, here is my name when I was 6, and here is what my brother thought about December and lambs, and here is a ship someone drew a long time before he ever saw a real one. It would be a way of carrying the house forward, in a small way. Not the house itself, which she was leaving, but something of what the house had held, the particular tenderness of a family teaching its children, marking their growth, keeping their small drawings and observations in the margins of books that got passed down. That tenderness did not have to end just because the house was changing hands. It could continue in 2 rooms in Ashkam, with whatever children happened to find their way there, on whatever evenings for whatever years remained. She held the primer against her chest for a moment, the way you might hold something precious and slightly fragile. Then she carried it down the narrow attic stairs, carefully, the way the stairs required, and out onto the landing, where the door frame stood in full mid-morning light, the column of marks, old and new, clearly visible, the folded note hidden behind it. She looked at the frame one more time. Then she went down the main stairs, for the last time, the 3rd step creaking, the same sound it had always made, the sound it would go on making, for whoever came next, whether they understood it or not. In the kitchen, she gathered the few things she had set aside, the primer, wrapped now in a cloth to protect it, the rosemary cutting, already in her coat pocket, wrapped in its damp cloth, the photograph of her mother, also in her pocket, wrapped for safety in a handkerchief. She had a small bag, not much, just a carpet bag that had been her mother's, that held, along with these last things, the few other items she was taking, some clothes, a Bible, a handful of small personal things that had been sorted, in the difficult weeks, into the category of Bess's to keep. the lamp Walter had sent, and the chair from Mrs. Pollard's late husband, and whatever furniture Bess was bringing to the cottage. These had already gone 2 days ago, carried by a neighbour's cart to Ashkam, where they waited for her in the 2 rooms that would, from tonight, be her home. What remained this morning was just her, and the house, and the 2 hours now nearly spent. She stood in the kitchen doorway, the door open onto the yard. The morning fully arrived, the sun well up over the rise toward Ashkam, and she looked back into the kitchen one more time. The hearth, cold, the table, scrubbed and bare, the window with its familiar view, the worn path in the flagstones, leading from where she stood to the hearth and back, the path her feet had made, that her mother's feet had made before her, that no one's feet would make again. Not in this particular way, not with this particular history, though other feet would walk this floor, and other paths would be worn, eventually, by other people, into other shapes. She thought about saying something, out loud, to the room, the way people sometimes did, in stories, a final word to a place that had mattered to them. But it felt, standing there, unnecessary. She had said everything, this morning, in the only way that mattered, by walking through, by touching, by remembering, by adding her mark to the column and her note behind the frame. The house knew she had been here. The house had always known. That was what the marks were, after all. The house's way of knowing, the only way a house could know anything, through the accumulated evidence of presence, of contact, of bodies moving through space and leaving, in moving, some trace of themselves behind. She did not need to say goodbye out loud. The goodbye was already there, in everything she had touched this morning, in the new pencil line above the old ones, in the note folded behind the wood. She picked up the carpet bag. She stepped out into the yard and pulled the kitchen door closed behind her. Not locked. It had never been locked, and she was not going to be the one to start, on this last morning, locking a door that had stood open for 52 years. Whoever came next could decide about locks. That was theirs to decide, now. She walked across the yard, toward the gate, the carpet bag in one hand. The morning was fully warm now. The last good day, she thought, looking at the sky, which was a clear pale blue, with only a few high thin clouds, the kind of September day that felt, in its warmth and its light, almost like summer, even though the turning had already begun, the first yellow already showing in the orchard's leaves, the blackberries in the hedgerow going soft and over. At the gate she stopped and turned and looked back at the house. Greenhollow stood in the morning light the way it had stood for as long as anyone could remember, long and low, grey stone gone gold where the light caught it, the thatch dark still with whatever dampness the night had left, the chimney without smoke, the windows reflecting the sky in flat bright rectangles that gave nothing away about what was or wasn't inside. From here, from the gate, the same gate she had come through 2 hours ago, with its particular twist of the latch that only the Tarrants knew, though anyone could learn it. The house looked, she thought, exactly as it always had, exactly as it had looked on the morning of her mother's funeral, 20 years ago, when she had stood at the kitchen window and thought, I don't know how to do this without her. Exactly as it had looked every morning of her life, arriving back from some errand, some visit, and seeing it there, ahead, waiting, the particular shape of it against the sky, a shape so familiar that she had never, until perhaps this morning, really seen it as a shape at all, simply as home, the place that was always there, that she was always coming back to. She would not be coming back to it, not after today. The clerk would arrive at 10. She could see now, looking down the lane, a small, dark figure approaching, still some distance off, but moving steadily. The clerk on foot or perhaps on a bicycle, coming early perhaps to be ready for the inventory. She had perhaps 10 minutes more. She stood at the gate and looked at the house and thought, I will remember this. Not just generally. She would remember Greenhollow generally for the rest of her life. That was not in question. But this specific morning, the light, the quiet, the particular quality of these 2 hours, room by room, mark by mark, this she wanted to hold on to specifically, not as a general memory of the last morning, but as the actual experience of it, the actual sequence, the cold hearth, the worn pump handle, the door frame and its column of marks, the rosemary cutting, the apple eaten in the orchard, the note folded behind the wood. She thought, this is mine now. In a way the house itself never was. Not really. The house belonged to whoever held the deed, and the deed had changed hands today, the way it had changed hands before, generations ago, when the Tarrants first came to Greenhollow, and would change hands again, presumably generations from now, to people not yet born. But this morning, this specific 2 hours, this walk through the rooms, this conversation between her and the house, in the Eats-Sohom, only language houses speak, this belonged to her entirely. No one could buy it or sell it or take it away. It was hers, the way the highest mark on the door frame was hers, the way the rosemary cutting in her pocket was hers, small, portable, alive in its way, carried forward into whatever came next. The figure on the lane was closer now, close enough that Bess could see it was, indeed, the clerk, a young man from the solicitor's office in Sherborne, walking with a leather case under his arm, the case that presumably held the papers for the inventory. He had not seen her yet, or if he had not yet adjusted his pace, was still walking at the same steady businesslike pace, the pace of someone with a job to do and a schedule to keep. Bess turned away from the gate, toward the lane that led, in the other direction, toward Ashkam, the same lane she had walked down 2 hours ago in the grey light before sunrise, except that now she would walk it the other way, toward the village, toward the cottage, toward whatever came next. She did not wait for the clerk. There was nothing to say to him that the solicitor had not already said, no information she could give him that he would need from her. The house was empty, ready for the inventory, exactly as arranged. She had no wish to be present when he arrived, to watch him walk into the kitchen with his ledger and his businesslike manner, and begin the process of converting Greenhollow, room by room, into a list of items with values attached. So much for the dresser, so much for the table, so much for the pump and the hearth and the very stones of the walls. If it came to that, though it would not, the house and land themselves being the larger part of what was being sold this afternoon, the contents merely the remainder. She walked up the lane, away from the gate, away from the house, toward Ashkam. Behind her she heard, faintly, because she was already some distance off. But the morning was very still, and sound carried. The gate's latch, the particular sound it made, the twist that only the Tarrants knew, except that the clerk, evidently, had managed it too, on his first try, the way Bess had told herself hours ago that anyone could learn it readily enough. She did not turn around. The lane back to Ashkam was the same lane, of course. There was only the one lane, connecting Greenhollow to the village, and Bess had walked it, in both directions, more times than could possibly be counted, across 52 years. But it felt different, walking it now, with the carpet bag in her hand and the morning sun fully up and the house behind her growing smaller, though she did not look back to check this, did not turn to watch it diminish, the way people sometimes did in stories, a long, lingering look back at a place they were leaving. She simply walked, the way she had always walked this lane, at her own steady pace, neither hurrying nor lingering, and the house behind her became with each step slightly further away, slightly more behind her, the way places always do when you walk away from them, whether you watch them go or not. The hedgerows were the same, heavy with blackberries, unpicked, going soft, the same hedgerows she had walked past 2 hours ago in the grey light, now lit gold by the climbing sun. She picked one in passing, a good one, dark and full, not yet gone over, and ate it the way she had eaten the apple in the orchard, a small private observance, the last blackberry from this lane, this year for her, though there would be other blackberries, in other years, in other hedgerows, around Ashkam, near the cottage. Blackberries grew everywhere in Dorset, in every hedge and waste corner, an abundance that belonged to no one and everyone, that did not require owning a farm to enjoy. She thought about this, about all the things that did not require owning Greenhollow, that she could still have in Ashkam, in the smaller life ahead of her. Blackberries from the hedgerows, the smell of rosemary from the cutting she carried, which would grow, in time, into its own bush in the cottage garden, the taste of apples, in season, from whatever trees grew near Ashkam, not the beauty of Bath from the Waterloo tree, not that exact taste, but apples nonetheless, the general autumn abundance of an English September, which existed everywhere, not just at Greenhollow. The specific things, the door frame, the pump handle, the worn chair, the particular view from the kitchen window toward Ashkam's church tower. These she was leaving, and they would not come with her, except as memory, except as the photograph and the primer and the rosemary cutting, small physical anchors for memories that would, otherwise, have nothing to attach to, once the house itself was gone from her daily life. But the general things, the blackberries, the light, the particular quality of a Dorset September morning, the taste of apples and the smell of rosemary and the sound of rooks in elm trees, these were not Greenhollow's alone. These belonged to the place more broadly, to Dorset itself, to this particular corner of England in this particular season, and Bess would have access to all of it, still, in Ashkam, 2 miles away, in 2 rooms with a small garden where rosemary, in time, would grow. She walked on, eating the blackberry, the juice staining her fingers slightly, the way blackberry juice always did, the way it had stained her fingers every September of her life, in this lane, on this walk, between Greenhollow and Ashkam, a small continuity, almost too small to notice, except that Bess, this morning, was noticing everything, the way you notice things on days that mark an ending, when the ordinary suddenly reveals itself as something that was always, in fact, extraordinary, simply by being repeated, faithfully, for as long as a life lasts. She came after a while to the place in the lane where she remembered this from this morning, walking the other way. You could see, on a clear day, the church tower of Ashkam ahead, sitting on its small rise, the village gathered around it. She could see it now, closer than it had been from the kitchen window, but still some distance off, the tower pale against the blue sky, the roofs of the village visible around it, smoke rising from several chimneys now, the ordinary morning life of Ashkam proceeding, the way it always did, regardless of what was or wasn't happening at Greenhollow. This was where she was going. Not just generally. Ashkam, the village she had known her whole life, where she had been christened and would, presumably, in some years' time, be buried, in the churchyard with her parents and the earlier Tarrants, but specifically, the cottage, Mrs. Pollard's cottage, 2 rooms and a garden, on a lane near the church, where her furniture waited, where the lamp Walter had sent stood ready to be lit this evening for the first time in its new home. She thought about the evening ahead, her first evening in the cottage, alone, in rooms that were not yet hers in the way Greenhollow had been hers, that she had not yet worn into the shape of her life, that did not yet hold any marks of her presence at all. It would take time. She understood this, walking toward Ashkam in the strengthening morning light. The cottage would not feel like home tonight, or tomorrow, or perhaps for some considerable time. It would simply be a place she was in, unfamiliar in its particulars. The chair not yet fitting her the way the old chair had fit her. The floors not yet known by her feet. The doors not yet learned in their particular sticking points and required pressures. But it would happen. This was, she thought, the thing she understood now. Walking this lane for what she supposed was the 10,000th time, but the first time as someone who no longer had a home at the other end of it. Houses became homes through exactly the process she had spent this morning witnessing in reverse, through repetition, through the body's slow accumulation of knowledge about a space, through marks made and worn day after day, year after year, until the space and the person became, in some sense, the same thing, each shaped by the other. It had taken 52 years for Greenhollow to become what it had been to her this morning, a house so completely hers that walking through it had felt like reading her own life, written in worn stone and smooth wood and pencil marks on a door frame. The cottage would not become that, not in the time she had left. She was 52, and people did not generally get another 52 years, not at her age, in her family. Her own mother had died at 56, her father at 71. Neither of them cut short in any way that would seem, to an outside eye, tragic, but enough, in either case, for a life to be considered broadly complete. But it would become something, some smaller version, perhaps, of what Greenhollow had been, a place where her hands learned new shapes, where her feet learned new floors, where the rosemary cutting grew into its own bush and, perhaps in time, was cut from in turn by someone else, continuing. Not nothing. Something. A new beginning, modest, late, but real. The kind of beginning that was, she thought, walking toward the church tower in the morning light, available to almost anyone, at almost any age, as long as they were willing to do what beginnings required, to walk into an unfamiliar room and sit in an unfamiliar chair and let the slow work of belonging start again, from nothing, the way it always had, for everyone, at the very start of everything. She reached Ashkam a little before 11. The village was going about its ordinary morning business. She passed the smithy, where Tom Carver was already at work, the ring of his hammer audible from some distance. She passed the shop, where Mrs. Loder was setting out the morning's bread in the window. She passed the church, where the door stood open, as it generally did during the day, and where she could see, inside, the particular cool dimness of the nave, the same dimness it had held for centuries, through every change that had ever happened to every family in the parish. People nodded to her as she passed, not with any particular note of sympathy, because the village did not, this morning, know the precise hour of what was happening at Greenhollow, only the general fact, which everyone had known for weeks, that the Tarrant farm was being sold and that Bess Tarrant was moving into the Pollard cottage. It was sad news, in the way that such news always was, in a place where everyone had known everyone for generations and felt genuinely the loss of a family's land even when the loss was not their own. But it was also, by this point, old news, the kind of thing that had been discussed sympathetically weeks ago and had now settled into the ordinary texture of village awareness. Yes, the Tarrant place, terrible business. But there it is, these things happen, and Bess seems to be managing. She was managing. She nodded back to the people she passed. Mrs. Loder, who called out something kind about the bread being fresh if Bess wanted any for her first night in the cottage. Old Mr. Carver's wife, who simply touched Bess's arm as she passed, briefly, without saying anything, which was, in its way, the most eloquent response Bess received all morning. She came to the lane where Mrs. Pollard's cottage stood, a small lane off the main street, with 3 or 4 cottages on it, all of them similar, stone-built, thatched, 2 rooms up and 2 down, or, in the smaller ones, like the one Bess was taking, 2 rooms only, with a lean-to scullery at the back and a small garden. The cottage door was unlocked. Mrs. Pollard had left it so, knowing Bess would arrive sometime this morning, and Bess pushed it open and stepped inside, into the front room that would be, from today, her sitting room and kitchen combined, with the second room behind it for sleeping. Her furniture was there, as the neighbour's cart had left it 2 days ago. The table and 2 chairs from Greenhollow's kitchen, not the good chairs from the parlour which had gone to auction, but 2 plain kitchen chairs that had been hers to take. The chest of drawers from her old bedroom, the lamp Walter had sent, sitting on the table, not yet filled with oil, not yet lit, and the chair from Mrs. Pollard's late husband, which stood by the small window, in the spot where Bess had thought, when she first viewed the cottage, that a chair by a window would be useful for sewing in the light. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at it. The small room, full of half-familiar furniture arranged in an unfamiliar way, the light coming through the window at an angle she did not yet know, onto a floor she had not yet walked. Then she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, not the particular sound of Greenhollow's kitchen door, The long, low sigh from the well-oiled hinge. This door made a different sound, a shorter, plainer sound. The sound of a door that had not yet been oiled by her, that did not yet know her hand on its latch. It would learn. She would learn it too. The particular pressure this latch required, the particular sound this door made, the particular creaks, if any, in this floor, the particular way light fell through this window at this hour, on this date, in this season. It would take time, but she had time, not unlimited time. She was 52 and understood, without dwelling on it, the general shape of what remained. But time enough for a rosemary cutting to take root and grow, time enough for a chair to begin, slowly, to fit, time enough for a primer to be read aloud on some future evening to some child from the village, by lamplight, in a room that would, by then, have become not Greenhollow, never Greenhollow, but something of its own, home. She set down the carpet bag. She unwrapped carefully the things she had carried, the photograph of her mother, which she set on the small mantel above the cottage's modest fireplace, a fireplace far smaller than Greenhollow's hearth, but a fireplace nonetheless, a place for a fire, and for objects to be set above it, the way objects had always been set above hearths in houses of every size. She set the photograph there now, her mother, 30 years younger than she had been at her death, looking out with that nervous, trying to be composed expression into this new room, this new mantle, this new chapter of whatever it was that photographs did, which was simply to remain, to be looked at by whoever was in the room to look. She unwrapped the primer next and set it on the small shelf beside the window, not hidden away, but visible, available, the kind of book that might be picked up on some future evening and read aloud, the way she had imagined on the walk from Greenhollow. And the rosemary cutting, she went out immediately into the small garden behind the cottage, before the cutting could wilt any further, and she found a spot near the back wall, in good sun, and she planted it, pressing the soil around the stem the way she had pressed soil around cuttings and seedlings her entire life, the motion as familiar as anything else her hands knew. Transferable, it turned out, from one garden to another, the way the motion of planting did not belong to any particular garden, but simply to hands that knew how to plant, wherever they happened to be. She stood back and looked at it. A small green sprig, 6 inches of rosemary, in a patch of bare soil in an unfamiliar garden. It looked very small. It looked, if she was honest, slightly forlorn. A single cutting in new ground, with no guarantee it would take, no certainty that it would grow into anything at all. But it might. Rosemary struck easily, everyone knew that. And if in a few weeks she saw new growth, the small bright green tips that meant a cutting had rooted and was properly alive, then this garden, this small, unfamiliar garden behind a cottage she had lived in for less than an hour, would have, in it, something that connected directly, unbroken, to the garden at Greenhollow, to the bush by the dairy wall that had been there longer than anyone could say, to whatever original planting generations ago had started the whole continuous line. The thread would not be broken. It would simply be longer now, stretching from wherever it had begun, through Greenhollow, through this cutting, into this new garden, into whatever future the cutting had, however long or short that future turned out to be. She went back inside. She filled the lamp with oil. There was a can of it among the things the neighbor had brought, set aside for exactly this purpose. And she set the lamp on the table, ready for the evening, ready to be lit for the first time in its new home. When the light failed and the small rooms needed, for the first time, the warm yellow glow that Walter's lamp had given to her sewing at Greenhollow for these last several years. The morning was nearly gone. It was past 11 now, she thought, though she had no clock yet in the cottage. Mrs. Pollard's late husband's clock having gone, presumably, with whatever else of his had been disposed of, and Bess's own small clock, the one from the kitchen mantel at Greenhollow, was, she remembered now, still there, on the mantel, because she had not thought to take it, because taking it had not occurred to her this morning among everything else. It did not matter. She would get a clock in time, or she would not, and would simply learn the way people in villages had always learned, to tell time by the church bell, by the quality of the light, by the rhythms of a place that did not, in its essentials, require precise timekeeping. She sat down for the first time in the chair by the window. Mrs. Pollard's late husband's chair, sturdy, plain, not yet hers in any sense except possession. It did not fit her. She felt this immediately. The proportions were slightly different from her old chair, the seat slightly higher, the arms positioned differently, so that her hands, resting on them, did not find the worn, smooth places her hands expected, because there were no worn, smooth places. Not yet. Not for her. There might be worn places from Mr. Pollard's hands, over whatever years he had used this chair, but those would not match Bess's hands, would not have the same shape, the same pressure points. She sat in the chair and felt the strangeness of it, the strangeness of being, after 52 years in one set of grooves, suddenly without any grooves at all, sitting in a chair that did not yet know her, in a room that did not yet know her, in a village that knew her well, had known her whole life, but that she was, in this specific sense, in the sense of this room, this chair, this particular daily life, encountering for the first time. It was, she thought, sitting there in the unfamiliar chair with the September light coming through the unfamiliar window, a kind of beginning. Not the kind of beginning that gets celebrated. No one threw a party for a 52-year-old woman starting again in 2 rooms, with a rosemary cutting and a primer and a photograph of her dead mother. It was a quiet beginning, almost invisible, the kind that happened to people all the time, all over England, all over the world probably. People whose lives had been built around one set of circumstances, finding those circumstances changed, and having to build again, smaller, later, but again, nonetheless. She thought about her father. At 17, the last mark on the doorframe before her own. J.T., 17, 1835. He had been 17, full grown, on the edge of his own adult life, and that life had unfolded over the following decades into everything Bess had known: the marriage, the children, the slow accumulation of a farm's daily life, the eventual long decline, and the debts and the sale, all of it ahead of him, at 17, unknown, the way all futures are unknown to the people standing at their threshold. She was 52, not 17. Most of her life, by any reasonable measure, was behind her, rather than ahead. But some of it. She sat in the unfamiliar chair and felt this distinctly. For the first time since the difficult news of the sale had become certain, some weeks ago, some of it was still ahead. Not much, perhaps, but some. Enough for a rosemary bush to grow, enough for a chair to begin to fit, enough, perhaps, for an evening or two of reading aloud to some village child, by lamplight, from a primer with her own name in the front of it, written in 1843, in a careful child's hand, in a house that no longer belonged to her, in a life that had been and remained, despite everything, hers. In the afternoon, she did not go to watch the auction. She had no wish to be there, to hear the figures called out, to watch strangers walk through the rooms she had walked through this morning, to see the cart and the few remaining implements and whatever else was being sold go to whoever bid highest. Instead, she spent the afternoon in the cottage, doing the small necessary tasks of settling, unpacking the few clothes she had brought, finding places for things in the chest of drawers, sweeping the small rooms, out of the same instinct, she supposed, that had swept Greenhollow's yard yesterday, the instinct toward beginnings that started, the way all proper beginnings did, with things in their right places, surfaces clean, the small order that made a space habitable. Mrs. Pollard came by in the late afternoon with a basket, bread and a portion of stew, and a few other things, the kind of practical kindness that villages extended to their own, especially to a woman on her first day in a new home. She did not stay long. She could see, perhaps, that Bess wanted the afternoon to herself, for now, with the larger welcomes and visits to come in the following days, as was proper, but not today, not on the first day, when a person needed, more than anything, simply to be in the new place, alone, beginning to know it. Bess thanked her, and Mrs. Pollard went, and Bess was alone again, in the cottage, as the afternoon light began to lengthen and turn gold, the same gold, she thought, that had filled the kitchen at Greenhollow this morning, the same September gold, because it was the same day, the same sun, simply arriving now at a different angle, in a different window, 2 miles away. She made tea. There was a small range in the cottage, smaller than Greenhollow's, but functional, and she had brought, among her things, the kettle that had been hers specifically, the one she had used for her own morning tea these last years, separate from the larger kettle that had served the household. And she sat at the table, in one of the kitchen chairs from Greenhollow, with a cup of tea, and looked out the window at the small garden where the rosemary cuttings stood, still small, still uncertain, in its patch of bare soil. She thought about the door frame, 2 miles away, with its column of marks and its hidden note, sitting there, right now, in the empty house, while strangers, perhaps, walked through the rooms below, the auction concluded, or concluding, the farm's future being decided in figures and signatures, none of which had anything to do with the marks on that door frame, which existed in a different register entirely, a register that money could not buy or sell, only, possibly, notice, or fail to notice, depending on who came to live in the house and what kind of attention they brought with them. She had done what she could. The rest was not hers to control, had never been hers to control, really. Even the marks themselves, made by her mother and her father over decades, had not been made with any thought of control, any plan for what would happen to them eventually. They had simply been made in the moment, out of love, the way such things always were. And what happened to them afterward, what happened to anything afterward, was a separate question, belonging to a different time, to people not yet known. She drank her tea. The light in the small window went from gold to amber, the particular color of a September evening beginning, and somewhere outside, faintly, she heard the church bell. 6 o'clock, she supposed, though she could not be entirely certain, not having a clock, but it felt like 6 o'clock, the quality of the light suggesting it, her body's long habit of knowing the time by the light, asserting itself even here, in this new place, on this first evening. As the light failed, she lit the lamp. It was the first time, Walter's lamp, sent from Canada some years ago, used every evening at Greenhollow for her sewing, now here, in this cottage, being lit for the first time in its new home. She trimmed the wick carefully, the way she always had, and lit it, and the flame caught and steadied, and the warm yellow light spread across the small table, across the primer on its shelf, across the photograph of her mother on the mantel, across the room that was, as of this evening, hers. She sat in the chair by the window, Mr. Pollard's chair, still unfamiliar, still not quite fitting, and she took out from her sewing basket, which had also come with her, a piece of mending, a shirt that needed a button, simple work, the kind of thing her hands knew how to do without thinking, regardless of what chair she was sitting in, what room she was in, what house. Her hands threaded the needle, in the lamplight, the way they had threaded needles for 50 years. This, at least, transferred completely. This skill that lived entirely in her hands and required nothing from the room around her, no familiarity, no worn grooves, just hands and needle and thread and the particular quality of lamplight, which was the same quality wherever the lamp was lit, because it was the lamp's quality, not the room's. She sewed for a while, in the gathering dark outside the window, the lamp making its small warm world inside, the village settling into its evening quiet around her, sounds she did not yet recognize individually, the way she had recognized every sound at Greenhollow, but sounds that were, she supposed, beginning even now, on this first evening, to become familiar, the way all sounds eventually did, given enough repetition. A dog somewhere, the church clock striking the half-hour, footsteps on the lane outside, someone walking home in the dusk. She thought about the house 2 miles away, empty now, presumably. The auction concluded. The new owners, whoever they were, she did not yet know. The solicitor would tell her in due course, perhaps already making their first arrangements, or perhaps not yet. Perhaps the house would stand empty for some days or weeks before anyone moved in, the way houses sometimes did in the gap between sales, a strange, suspended time when a house belonged to someone but was inhabited by no one. In that gap, however long it lasted, the marks would still be there. The column on the door frame, old marks and new, and the note folded behind the wood, waiting, the way such things waited, for whoever eventually found them, whenever that turned out to be. She thought, it doesn't matter when. That was the thing about marks, about notes, about anything left behind for an unknown future. They did not require a particular timeline. They simply existed, patiently, The way the rosemary had existed for generations before anyone thought to take a cutting from it. The way the door frame had existed with its space above the highest mark for 36 years before anyone filled it. Things waited. That was what old houses did in the end. They waited patiently for whoever came next, holding in their worn wood and smooth stone the evidence of everyone who had ever lived in them, available to anyone who thought to look, for as long as the house itself stood. She finished the button. She bit off the thread, the way she always had, and set the shirt aside, and sat for a moment in the lamplight, in the chair that did not yet fit her, in the room that was not yet home, but would be, in time, the way all such things became, in time, what they were going to become, through nothing more complicated than presence, repeated day after day, until presence became history, and history became the kind of mark a house could keep. Outside, the September evening settled fully into dark. The lamp burned steadily. 2 miles away, an empty house stood in the same darkness, holding what it held, waiting. Bess sat by her lamp, in her new chair, in her new room, and let the evening be what it was, the first of many, the beginning of whatever came next. And now you can sleep too. You have walked through the rooms tonight, the kitchen with its cold hearth, the dairy and its empty shelves, the stairs with the step that creaks, the door frame with its column of marks going back nearly 70 years. You have crouched on a landing in the early light and found your own earliest mark, low on a frame, and you have stood perhaps a little straighter and added one more line above all the others just to say, I was here. Houses remember. Not in the way people remember, not in words, not in stories told aloud, but in worn stone and smoothed wood, and the particular pitch of a door that has opened 10,000 times, in marks that mean nothing to a stranger and everything to the person who made them or who is named beside them, in pencil, growing taller year by year, until the marking simply stops, because there is nothing more to measure. Wherever you are tonight, in a house you've lived in for years, or a room that's still new to you, or somewhere in between, some part of it already knows you. Some small wear, some worn place, some sound it makes only for you, that you've stopped noticing because it's always there. That's not nothing. That's a kind of being known. Let the evening settle. Let the lamp burn low. Whatever room you're in, it's holding you, the way rooms do, quietly, patiently, without needing to be thanked. You can rest now. You're held. Sleep well. Good night.